At my son's birthday party, his wife's family feasted on expensive king crab and prime steak while I was offered nothing but a cold basket of dry bread. His wife sneered loudly, declaring that feeding premium seafood to a poor old man with no future was a massive waste of money. When I looked at my son for support, he simply sighed and ordered me to go home so I would not ruin their high society aesthetic. I did not argue or raise my voice. I smiled, said I understood perfectly, and walked out the door. They laughed mockingly at my exit, entirely unaware that my silence was the sound of their luxurious world, coming to a permanent, devastating end. My name is Cyrus. I am 70 years old, and what happened at my son's birthday dinner changed our family permanently. The restaurant was an exclusive high society establishment located in the wealthiest district of the city. It was the kind of place where the crystal chandeliers shone brighter than the character of the people sitting underneath them, and the staff treated patrons based entirely on the brand of their watch. Darren, my only son, was celebrating his 35th birthday. His wife Abigail had organized the dinner, ensuring her parents Thomas and Diane received the best seats at the table. The evening started with thinly veiled insults and quickly descended into blatant disrespect. The waiter arrived carrying massive silver platters overflowing with prime filet mignon and giant steaming king crab legs, setting them carefully in front of Abigail and her parents. The rich scent of garlic butter and roasted meat filled the air, making my stomach rumble softly. I waited patiently for my plate, assuming the kitchen was simply running behind. It never arrived. Instead, Abigail picked up a small wicker basket containing 3 pieces of cold complimentary dinner rolls and pushed it across the white linen tablecloth until it hit my water glass. She did not even have the decency to look me in the eye. She casually announced to the table that ordering a $50 plate of crab for an old man with a fading palate was a terrible financial investment. She laughed a high and grating sound and declared, "I would probably be just as happy eating a cheap bowl of soup at a local diner." Thomas, her father, chuckled loudly while wiping melted butter from his chin. He looked directly at my faded corduroy jacket and told Darren that he should really buy his father some new clothes, so I would not look so terribly out of place in civilized company. The racial microaggressions and classist insults were not subtle, but they were delivered with the polished arrogance of people who believed their newfound wealth made them entirely untouchable. I slowly ran my thumb over the frayed cuff of my jacket, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I did not buy new clothes because I did not need to impress anyone sitting at that table. I wore this exact jacket 40 years ago, when I signed the first major federal shipping contract that built Sentinel Logistics from a single rusted delivery truck into a nationwide corporate empire. I had spent 4 decades surviving ruthless corporate wars, navigating a hostile business world that constantly underestimated a young African-American entrepreneur. I built my immense fortune in absolute silence, preferring the quiet, genuine comfort of my home over flashy, artificial society galas. After my beloved wife Valerie passed away 5 years ago, the crushing weight of grief forced me to step back from the daily operations of my holding company. I handed Darren the management of a minor subsidiary branch, hoping the heavy responsibility would teach him leadership discipline and humility. Instead, he used my quiet retreat as a convenient excuse to completely reinvent his history. He met Abigail, a woman pathologically obsessed with high society status, and allowed her entire family to believe he was a self-made millionaire. He foolishly mistook my profound grief for cognitive weakness and my deliberate modesty for crushing inescapable poverty. I sat at that lavish table, surrounded by people feasting on food purchased with the dividends of my lifelong labor, and I watched the grotesque display of their newly acquired arrogance. I kept my face perfectly calm, suppressing the bitter disappointment rising in my chest. I waited for my son to intervene to fiercely defend the father who had sacrificed everything to ensure he never knew the harsh sting of hunger or the dark humiliation of poverty. The ultimate betrayal did not come from Abigail or her entitled, arrogant parents. It came from my own flesh and blood. Darren finally wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin, letting out a heavy sigh, and looked at me with an expression of a deep, unmasked annoyance. He did not reprimand his wife for her staggering cruelty. He did not tell Thomas to show respect to a man twice his age. Instead, Darren leaned across the table, his face flushed with expensive wine, and told me to just go home. He lowered his voice, acting as if my very presence was a shameful, dirty burden he was tragically forced to carry. He explicitly told me I was ruining the refined aesthetic of his birthday party and making things incredibly awkward for Abigail's wealthy parents. He suggested I take a taxi back to my apartment immediately because they were planning to order imported champagne and my faded working-class clothes were drawing unwanted attention from the restaurant management. The entire table erupted in cruel, mocking laughter. Diane covered her mouth to hide her vicious giggles, whispering loudly to Thomas that it was a massive relief I was finally leaving so they could enjoy their meal in peace. I looked at the boy I had raised, the child I had protected from every harsh and ugly reality of the world, and I saw a complete, irredeemable stranger. The loving son I knew had died, replaced by a hollow, pathetic shell of a man who valued the approval of a prejudiced, greedy family over the dignity of his own father. The pain in my chest was incredibly sharp, but it quickly solidified into a cold, calculated, and absolute determination. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or cause a public scene, because true power never needs to shout to be heard. I stood up slowly from the table, adjusted my faded jacket with meticulous care, and looked directly into Darren's eyes. I smiled politely, keeping my voice steady, and told him that I understood the situation perfectly. I wished him a happy birthday, pushed my chair in, and walked away from the table, without a single backward glance. I could hear their triumphant, relieved laughter, resuming the moment. I turned my back, echoing off the marble walls as the heavy restaurant doors closed behind me. They thought my silence was the pathetic, broken surrender of a defeated old man who knew his place. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was the definitive beginning of their complete financial and social ruin. I stepped out into the freezing night air, pulling my secure smartphone from my pocket. I did not call a taxi to go home and weep. I dialed the private direct line of my lead wealth manager, Bradley. He answered on the second ring, instantly recognizing the serious urgency of a late-night call from my private number. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or explanations. I issued a single uncompromising command that would immediately sever the lifeblood of Darren's fraudulent, luxurious existence. Freeze the Blackwood Trust immediately, I instructed with absolute clarity. Cancel the corporate credit cards. Lock all the subsidiary operational accounts and prepare the forensic auditors for a comprehensive review. The time for quiet generosity has officially ended. I walked confidently down the illuminated city street, feeling the cold wind against my face, knowing with absolute certainty that by the time the sun rose, the luxurious world Darren and Abigail thought they owned would completely crumble into ash. The elevator doors chimed softly as I stepped onto the top floor of the financial district tower. The city lights far below looked like scattered embers, but inside Bradley's sterile glass-walled office, the only illumination came from the harsh glow of his dual monitors. Bradley did not offer me a drink or attempt small talk. He knew me well enough to understand that a midnight visit meant absolute war. I stood directly behind his leather chair, my hands resting lightly on the cold glass desk, and watched as he pulled up the highly encrypted ledgers for the subsidiary branches of Sentinel Logistics. The numbers painted a brutal, undeniable picture of systematic theft. Line by line, the financial logs revealed a massive web of deceit meticulously constructed over the past 36 months. Darren was not just skimming minor profits from the top. He had been aggressively bleeding the corporate operating accounts dry. He funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into Abigail's personal trusts to maintain her flawless high society facade. Worse still, he had established a complex series of ghost vendors to inject massive amounts of untraceable cash into a failing retail business owned by Thomas and Diane. My son was actively using the massive fortune I built, with my own blood and sweat, to artificially prop up the exact same people who had just humiliated me over a basket of dry bread. The sheer audacity of the embezzlement was staggering. Every illicit transfer was carefully buried under thick layers of fake corporate expenses, cleverly disguised as logistics consulting fees and international shipping tariffs. Darren thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. He thought I would never look. I stared at the glowing spreadsheets, feeling the heavy weight of history pressing against my chest. 5 years ago, I lost my beautiful wife Valerie to a sudden and terribly aggressive illness. Her death shattered the vibrant core of our family, leaving me, navigating a dark, suffocating fog of profound grief. For decades, Valerie had been the steady anchor of my life, the remarkable woman who stood by my side when I was just a young man, hustling for delivery routes in neighborhoods where folks who looked like me were routinely turned away. When she passed, the bustling boardroom felt entirely meaningless. I deliberately stepped back from the daily grinding operations of Sentinel Logistics. I handed Darren the reins of the primary subsidiary branch, stepping into the quiet shadows to mourn in peace. I genuinely believed the heavy burden of corporate responsibility would force my son to mature, teaching him the invaluable lessons of leadership discipline and fiscal humility. I wanted him to learn how to steer the ship through turbulent waters before I eventually handed over the entire fleet. That decision became my greatest mistake. I viewed my retreat as a necessary period of healing and a responsible passing of the torch. Darren viewed it through a lens of pure opportunistic greed. He mistook my quiet mourning for cognitive decline. He interpreted my deliberate absence as a glaring sign of terminal weakness, assuming the old man had finally gone senile and left the corporate vault door wide open. He firmly believed I was simply waiting to die, entirely oblivious to the vast empire I had built from absolutely nothing. He forgot that I learned to read complex ledgers before he was even born. Bradley typed rapidly, bringing up the categorized expense reports that Darren had arrogantly tried to hide behind a maze of shell corporations. The itemized receipts were a grotesque testament to boundless vanity and unearned entitlement. My son had squandered millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to the company pension fund, stealing directly from the hardworking drivers and warehouse staff who actually kept the business running. I read the line items in stony, unblinking silence. 3 luxury imported sports cars were registered directly in Abigail's name. $500,000 had been dropped at elite jewelry boutiques in a single afternoon. Exclusive generational country club memberships for Thomas and Diane were paid in full using corporate funds. They were living like untouchable royalty on the back of my lifelong labor. The sharp, agonizing sting of a father's betrayal rapidly cooled, hardening into a solid block of icy, unbreakable resolve. I did not feel an ounce of sorrow or pity for the boy I had raised. He had chosen his path the moment he let his wife mock my clothes at that dinner table. I placed my hand firmly on Bradley's shoulder. I instructed him to immediately initiate the asset reclamation protocol. This was a ruthless legal maneuver we had designed years ago to strictly protect the holding company from hostile corporate takeovers. I ordered Bradley to strip Darren of all administrative access, freeze every single trust fund associated with Abigail's name, and prepare the immediate eviction notices for all luxury properties held under the company umbrella. The time for silent observation was definitively over. It was time to systematically dismantle their luxurious illusion brick by brick. I wanted them to feel the exact same cold reality they had so casually handed to me. Just as Bradley began executing the severe lockdown commands, a jarring alarm pierced the quiet atmosphere of the office. A bright red alert flashed violently across the center of his primary monitor, bathing the dark room in a harsh crimson glow. Bradley leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening dangerously as he read the incoming data notification. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine shock. Darren had just uploaded a highly classified financial directive to the central banking portal. My son had meticulously forged my personal digital signature to authorize a massive $2 million wire transfer, directed straight into an untraceable offshore account. The illicit transaction was queued up in the system and fully scheduled to clear at dawn, which was only a few short hours away. Darren was attempting a desperate massive cash grab, clearly planning to secure his stolen wealth before the weekly accounting reviews could notice the missing funds. He truly thought he was outsmarting the system, playing a high-stakes game of corporate theft, while his elderly father slept. I stared at my forged signature glowing on the digital document. A cold, predatory calm washed entirely over me. I did not tell Bradley to cancel the transaction. Canceling it would alert Darren far too soon, giving him precious time to panic and actively destroy financial evidence. Instead, I ordered Bradley to intercept the transfer silently. I instructed him to reroute the $2 million directly back into my private secure holding account, but to let the digital confirmation receipt generate and send to Darren's phone anyway. Let him believe he has won the game, I told Bradley, keeping my voice perfectly steady and devoid of mercy. Let him wake up thinking he is a millionaire. We will let the steel trap snap shut when he feels the safest. I did not need to be physically present at the exclusive European auto dealership the next morning to know exactly how the jaws of my trap snapped shut around my son. I sat quietly in my study, sipping a dark cup of coffee, watching the consequences unfold in real time. Bradley had already placed a highly trained corporate investigator on the pristine showroom floor, blending in perfectly with the wealthy clientele to monitor the inevitable fallout. Through the secure audio and video feed transmitted directly to my tablet, I watched Darren and Abigail stride through the gleaming glass doors as if they owned the entire building. The bright morning sun reflected off the polished hoods of imported sports cars, matching the blinding arrogance radiating from my daughter-in-law. She was aggressively demanding the absolute newest convertible model, pointing a manicured finger at a rare vehicle, while snapping her other hand to summon a sales associate like a disobedient servant. They treated the hard-working dealership staff with absolute unapologetic disdain, loudly complaining about the slow service and threatening to have the manager fired. Abigail paraded around the showroom floor in her designer clothing, boasting loudly to anyone within earshot about her husband's limitless wealth and their elite social standing. She demanded a customized interior and an expedited delivery, refusing to even look at the exorbitant price tag displayed on the windshield. Darren stood beside her with a smug, inflated posture, acting like a self-made titan of industry rather than a man who had spent his entire adult life entirely dependent on his father's unseen labor. He foolishly believed that his forged wire transfer from the previous night had cleared successfully, securing his stolen millions. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently standing on a financial landmine, and I was holding the detonator. The moment of reckoning arrived when Darren casually guided Abigail toward the luxurious finance desk to finalize the exorbitant purchase. He pulled his thick leather wallet from his tailored trousers and handed over the heavy black corporate credit card with a deeply arrogant flourish. The seasoned finance manager accepted the card respectfully, completely unaware of the digital lockdown Bradley and I had executed just a few hours prior. I watched through the live feed as the manager swiped the card through the high-end processing terminal. Instantly, the machine emitted a harsh, loud beep and the screen flashed a brilliant, blinding red. Darren scoffed impatiently, loudly blaming the dealership's outdated technology and demanding the manager run the transaction a second time. The manager complied, but his polite smile quickly vanished as he stared at the terminal display. He excused himself, walking into a private back office to call the central banking authority. Two dealership security guards began subtly moving closer to the desk, sensing an escalating issue. Minutes later, the manager returned to the open showroom floor, but his demeanor had completely shifted from deferential to intensely severe. He walked directly up to Darren, carrying a pair of heavy steel scissors in his right hand. Before my son could utter a single word of complaint, the manager lifted the black corporate card and deliberately snipped it entirely in half right in front of their faces. The sharp snap of the thick plastic echoed loudly across the quiet showroom. The manager then looked Darren squarely in the eye and stated in a loud, firm voice that the primary account holder had officially flagged the card for felony fraud. He ordered them to leave the premises immediately before he contacted local law enforcement to report an attempted grand larceny. The profound humiliation struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. The quiet murmur of the high-end dealership died instantly, leaving dozens of incredibly wealthy patrons staring openly at the unfolding disgrace. Abigail's carefully constructed facade of aristocratic superiority shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her face flushed a deep, furious crimson as the surrounding customers began whispering and pointing at the couple who had just been publicly exposed as fraudulent imposters. She turned violently toward Darren, throwing her expensive designer purse onto the floor and unleashing a barrage of hysterical, vicious screams that echoed off the high glass ceilings. In her blind rage, she completely abandoned her sweet, devoted wife persona and revealed her absolute core motivation to the entire room. She shrieked that she had only married him because he explicitly claimed to be the sole independent owner of a massive logistics empire. She had absolutely no idea that her supposedly brilliant self-made husband was merely a salaried employee existing entirely within the vast shadows of my holding company. She called him a pathetic failure, publicly humiliating him for dragging her into a felony fraud investigation. Darren stood frozen in the center of the showroom, his face draining of all color as the horrific reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. He looked at the severed pieces of the black credit card resting on the polished desk, and the arrogant delusion he had harbored for years instantly evaporated. My son finally realized that his grieving elderly father had not gone senile. He realized that I had discovered his massive embezzlement, intercepted his cowardly offshore wire transfer, and completely severed the financial artery that kept his artificial life breathing. Panic completely consumed Darren as the dealership security guards began marching aggressively toward them. He grabbed Abigail by the arm and stormed out of the building, fleeing into the sprawling parking lot like a terrified criminal. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he frantically paced between the rows of expensive cars. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and immediately dialed Thomas, seeking refuge and guidance from the very man who had mocked my clothing the night before. Through the hidden microphone on my investigator's jacket, I listened intently as Darren's voice cracked with raw, unadulterated fear. He frantically declared to his father-in-law that I had completely lost my mind and gone dangerously insane. I could hear Thomas's muffled, panicked voice echoing through the phone speaker demanding an immediate solution to their sudden lack of funding. Instead of confessing his own monumental theft, Darren spun a desperate, malicious lie, claiming that my grief over Valerie had finally triggered a violent, destructive cognitive collapse. He paced frantically across the asphalt, promising Thomas that they would not lose their luxurious lifestyle or the funding for the retail business. He formulated a horrific, desperate plan right there in the parking lot. Darren promised Thomas that they would ambush me at my apartment, violently force me into a psychiatric lockdown facility today, and seize full uncontested legal power of attorney over the entire estate. He intended to strip away my human rights and lock me in a medical prison to bury his financial crimes forever. He hung up the phone with a dark, ruthless determination, fully believing he could overpower a frail old man. He did not realize he was walking blindly into a fortified trap, and his impending medical ambush would be the exact mechanism of his absolute destruction. The bitter taste of my lukewarm black coffee matched the quiet anticipation settling in my chest. I sat alone at the small oak table in my modest downtown apartment, enjoying the profound silence that only comes before a storm. I did not have to wait long. The heavy wooden front door of my sanctuary did not just open. It was violently kicked inward, the brass deadbolt splintering the doorframe and scattering wood chips across my entryway rug. Darren and Abigail marched directly into my home as if they were a federal raiding party seizing a condemned property. Their physical invasion of my private space was the ultimate demonstration of their absolute lack of respect for me as a human being. They did not come alone. Trailing closely behind their furious, panicked strides was a tall, excessively sweating man clutching a thick medical clipboard. This was Dr. Thorne, a corrupt private physician well known in elite circles for providing whatever legal medical documentation his wealthy clients required, no questions asked. Darren's chest was heaving, his expensive suit wrinkled from his humiliating retreat at the auto dealership just hours prior. He pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming that my mental breakdown had officially gone too far, and that he was taking permanent control of my life for my own safety. Abigail stood near the shattered doorway with her arms crossed, glaring at my simple furnishings with overt disgust, entirely convinced that her husband was about to legally strip me of my human rights today. I did not stand up or raise my voice in defense. I simply took another slow sip of my coffee and gestured politely for the sweating doctor to take a seat across from me. Dr. Thorne did not wait for an invitation to begin his theatrical performance. He sat down heavily across the table, clicked his silver pen, and immediately began speaking to me in the slow, patronizing tone of a kindergarten teacher addressing a highly confused toddler. He leaned forward, sporting a fake, sympathetic smile, and asked me a series of deliberately disorienting leading questions designed specifically to manufacture a diagnosis of severe late-stage dementia. He asked if I knew what city I was currently in, implying that my modest living conditions were a clear sign of profound cognitive neglect. He questioned if I was experiencing aggressive delusions about my finances, attempting to lay the legal groundwork to explain away my freezing of the corporate accounts. He asked if I had forgotten how to properly dress myself, gesturing subtly toward my faded but comfortable clothing. I recognized his exact strategy within seconds. I had spent 40 years sitting in ruthless corporate boardrooms, staring down predatory executives and dismantling deceptive legal contracts line by line. I built my entire logistics empire by reading the subtle, nervous tells of men who thought they could outsmart me. Dr. Thorne was deploying a standard cowardly legal trap, trying to get me to stumble over my words or react with justified anger so he could officially document me as hostile and legally incompetent. Darren hovered right behind the doctor, his eyes darting frantically around my apartment, silently praying that this corrupt medical ambush would secure his stolen fortune and erase his impending felony charges. He truly believed he could overwrite my 4 decades of sharp, calculated business acumen with a single fraudulent medical signature. I let the corrupt physician finish his condescending questionnaire without a single interruption. When he finally paused to click his pen, waiting for me to falter, I answered every single cognitive test with devastating, icy precision. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I looked directly into his eyes and recited the exact date, the current time, down to the very second, and the precise street address of my apartment building. I then proceeded to list the exact morning opening bell numbers for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, followed by the specific fractional yield percentages of the global logistics sector. I outlined the current profit margins of Sentinel Logistics down to the decimal point. To completely shatter the illusion of my supposed financial confusion, I calmly recited the exact routing number of the offshore bank account Darren had foolishly attempted to wire $2 million into at dawn. Dr. Thorne's fake, sympathetic smile vanished instantly. His hand began to tremble violently, the silver pen rattling against his heavy plastic clipboard. He looked nervously over his shoulder at Darren, slowly realizing that he had been blindly dragged into a catastrophic setup against a highly competent, extremely dangerous adversary. The doctor recognized that the man sitting across from him was not a senile, helpless victim waiting to be institutionalized, but a fully lucid, apex corporate predator who was currently holding all the cards. Abigail's arrogant sneer faltered as she watched the medical professional she had hired begin to visibly sweat and shrink back into his chair. The complete shift in power in the room was palpable, but I was not finished. I reached calmly beneath the table and produced a thick, sealed manila envelope. I slid it slowly across the smooth wood until it rested directly on top of Dr. Thorne's pristine clipboard. I politely suggested he open it before finalizing his medical evaluation of my mental health. He pulled the flap back with shaking fingers and stared at the documents inside. The envelope contained comprehensive, undeniable documentation of his massive, highly illegal gambling debts owed to a syndicate of ruthless underground bookmakers operating out of a neighboring state. My private investigators had tracked the crippling debt, and Bradley's corporate team had quietly purchased the entire sum that very morning through an anonymous shell corporation. I informed the pale, terrified doctor that my holding company now officially owned his life and his future. I suggested in a quiet, unwavering voice that he leave my property immediately and never attempt to practice medicine in my presence again, or those debts would be aggressively collected by less forgiving entities, and his license would be permanently revoked by the Federal Medical Board. Dr. Thorne did not utter a single word in his defense. All the blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost. He dropped his clipboard directly onto the floor, scrambled backward out of his chair, and literally sprinted out of my apartment, pushing violently past Abigail to escape into the hallway. Darren was left standing utterly alone in my kitchen, staring at the discarded clipboard in absolute paralyzed horror as his master plan evaporated into thin air. The sudden cowardly departure of the corrupt physician completely shattered the last remaining shreds of my son's composure. Darren stood frozen in the center of my kitchen for a few agonizing seconds, staring at the empty doorway where his expensive medical mercenary had just fled in absolute terror. When the reality of his monumental failure finally set in, a violent, ugly rage entirely consumed him. He let out a visceral scream of frustration and kicked one of my solid oak dining chairs across the room. The chair crashed violently into the living room wall, leaving a deep gouge in the drywall before clattering onto the hardwood floor. Darren did not apologize or collect himself. Instead, he marched aggressively toward the table and physically cornered me, looming over my seated figure with his fists tightly clenched at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged against the crisp white collar of his tailored shirt as he leaned down, completely invading my personal space. He abandoned all pretense of medical concern or familial duty, revealing the raw, desperate criminal underneath his polished exterior. He screamed directly into my face that he no longer needed a doctor to secure his stolen fortune. He explicitly threatened to forge the medical incompetency documents himself, claiming he had enough connections at the bank to push the paperwork through without verification. He warned me in a harsh, venomous tone that he was fully prepared to use brute physical force to make me sign over the holding company if I continued to resist. He truly believed that his youth and physical strength gave him ultimate authority over an elderly man sitting alone in a modest apartment. Abigail did not attempt to de-escalate her husband's violent outburst. Instead, she stepped away from the shattered doorway and eagerly joined the aggressive assault. She crossed her arms over her designer blouse, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She possessed a deeply ingrained toxic arrogance fueled by a lifetime of unearned privilege and racial superiority. Abigail leaned against the kitchen counter, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the granite, and delivered a vicious, highly calculated threat designed to completely paralyze me with fear. She leaned in closer and promised me with absolute terrifying confidence that if I dared to call the authorities to report their home invasion or Darren's physical intimidation, the situation would backfire spectacularly against me. She sneered, her voice dropping into a mocking, theatrical tone, detailing exactly how she would effortlessly weaponize her tears for the responding officers. She explicitly told me that the police would always choose to believe the frantic, sobbing testimony of a wealthy, elegant white woman over the desperate, unreliable ramblings of a confused, aggressively hostile old black man. She meticulously detailed her horrific plan to intentionally scratch her own arms and falsely claim I had violently attacked her in a sudden fit of severe dementia. She smiled with profound malice, fully believing that systemic prejudice was an invincible weapon she could easily wield to silence me forever. She stood there radiating a sickening dark pride, utterly convinced that my skin color and my advanced age stripped me of all societal power and basic legal protection. She believed I was completely cornered, totally defenseless, and entirely at the mercy of her deeply prejudiced, malicious narrative. They completely misunderstood the man they were attempting to terrorize. They looked at my simple, unpretentious apartment and saw only the meager living conditions of a vulnerable, fading retiree. They had absolutely no idea that my humble surroundings were a deliberate, highly sophisticated facade. Over the past 5 years, while mourning my wife and stepping back from daily logistics operations, I had heavily diversified my corporate portfolio. I directed millions of dollars of corporate profits into the research and development of advanced smart home security software, purchasing a controlling stake in a leading technology firm. I used my own downtown apartment as a primary testing ground for our most cutting-edge experimental surveillance systems. Behind the plain drywall, inside the ordinary light fixtures, and tucked seamlessly behind the mundane ventilation grates, my home was fully wired with state-of-the-art technology. The entire apartment was comprehensively monitored by an intricate network of hidden high-definition motion-activated cameras and ultra-sensitive omnidirectional microphones. The system was designed to record and instantly transmit flawless audio and crystal-clear video to a secure encrypted cloud server the moment it detected a hostile physical intrusion. I did not need to reach for a telephone to call the police or alert my private security team. The moment Darren kicked my front door off its hinges, the advanced surveillance grid silently woke up. Every single violent gesture, every scream threat of physical assault, and every deeply racist, extortionate promise Abigail proudly delivered had been captured in perfect, undeniable clarity. They thought they were operating in total secrecy, shielded by the walls of a lonely old man's home. I allowed their vicious threats to echo through the kitchen until the heavy silence returned to the room. I did not flinch, and I did not show an ounce of the fear they so desperately wanted to see. I calmly placed my coffee mug on the table, folded my hands neatly together, and raised my right index finger, pointing directly upward. I pointed straight at the standard, unassuming smoke detector mounted firmly on the ceiling just inches above Abigail's perfectly styled hair. I looked at my son and his arrogant wife, letting a cold, razor-sharp smile cross my face. I calmly informed them that their entire racist threat, along with Darren's explicit screaming admission of premeditated document forgery, was not just recorded. I explained that the system had just flawlessly live-streamed every single second of their horrific ambush directly to Bradley's corporate legal team and my private security firm. I watched the blood drain rapidly from Abigail's face as her eyes darted upward toward the blinking green light hidden within the plastic casing of the smoke detector. The invincible privilege shield she thought she possessed vanished instantly, replaced by the crushing realization that she had just proudly confessed to federal extortion on a live feed. Darren let out a guttural sound of pure panic. He blindly lunged across the kitchen table, his hands grasping desperately toward the ceiling in a pathetic, futile attempt to rip the camera from the drywall and destroy the damning evidence. But before his fingers could even brush the plastic casing, the sharp, piercing ringtone of his smartphone shattered the tense air. He froze mid-stride, staring down at the glowing screen in his pocket, completely unaware that the catastrophic news waiting on the other end of the line was about to obliterate his final remaining lifeline. Darren halted his frantic lunge toward the smoke detector, his arms suspended awkwardly in midair as the sharp, demanding ringtone of his smartphone sliced through the tense kitchen. He glared at me with pure hatred, but the caller ID on his screen commanded his immediate attention. It was Harrington, the lead commercial investor for the massive multi-million-dollar flagship warehouse development Darren had been boasting about for months. Darren swallowed hard, attempting to quickly smooth his wrinkled suit jacket and compose his voice before answering the call. He put the phone to his ear, projecting the fake confident tone of a seasoned executive, but that facade disintegrated within seconds. I could hear Harrington shouting through the tiny speaker, his voice vibrating with absolute fury and unmasked panic. The investor bluntly announced he was pulling every single dime out of the warehouse project effective immediately. Harrington screamed that his financial team had just received a catastrophic alert regarding a sudden total freeze on Darren's entire credit profile. Furthermore, the Federal Banking Commission had just placed a massive red flag on Darren's operating accounts due to suspected wire fraud. Harrington demanded to know why the primary corporate guarantors had vanished overnight, effectively leaving the entire development project completely unfunded and legally paralyzed. Darren stood frozen in the center of my apartment, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. The arrogant, untouchable persona melted away, exposing a terrified fraud who had just been publicly stripped of his stolen armor. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear as Harrington hung up, the dial tone buzzing loudly in the quiet room. The devastating reality of his financial execution finally registered in his wide, panicked eyes. Darren never actually possessed a single ounce of genuine wealth or business acumen of his own. He operated his entire adult life under a spectacular, glittering delusion, fully funded by my lifelong labor. When I started my logistics company decades ago, I had to fight tooth and nail against systemic redlining and deeply prejudiced banking institutions that refused to lend capital to a young African-American entrepreneur. I built an unblemished, ironclad credit score over 40 years by meticulously honoring every single contract, paying every debt early, and weathering brutal economic downturns through sheer discipline. Darren simply hijacked that pristine financial history. He used my name and my decades-old credit profile as unquestioned collateral to aggressively secure the initial funding for all of his glamorous vanity projects. He strutted into high society meetings, arrogantly signing his name on massive commercial loans, fully assuming that the limitless bank of his father would forever guarantee his reckless gambles. He truly believed he was a self-made visionary, entirely forgetting that his entire empire was built on a foundation of my silent, invisible guarantees. Without my explicit backing, Darren was entirely bankrupt. His net worth was not merely zero, it was severely negative, drowning in a sea of highly leveraged debt that he could never hope to repay on his own. The freezing of the trust accounts did not just cut off his access to luxury cars and expensive dinners. It completely obliterated the artificial financial structure holding his entire life together. He was a parasite who had just been forcefully detached from his host, and the swift, brutal withdrawal of my capital left him suffocating in the harsh light of reality. The shock paralyzing Darren quickly mutated into a wild and controllable desperation. He lunged toward the kitchen table, slamming his fists against the polished wood, and began screaming at me with the frantic, high-pitched intensity of a cornered animal. He demanded I pick up my phone and reverse the financial freeze immediately. He ordered me to call Harrington back and smooth over the federal red flags, wildly promising that he would forget about the medical ambush if I just restored his credit lines. His voice cracked as he hurled vicious insults, alternating between violent threats and pathetic sobbing pleas for financial mercy. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not engage in a shouting match with a desperate criminal. I employed the absolute crushing power of complete silence. I slowly stood up from my chair, keeping my expression entirely blank, and deliberately turned my back on his hysterical screaming. I walked casually over to the granite kitchen counter, picked up the glass carafe, and poured myself a fresh, steaming cup of dark roast coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich flavor while Darren continued to unravel just a few feet behind me. The sheer disrespect of ignoring his tantrum established my absolute dominance over the situation. I was treating the collapse of his entire world with the exact same casual indifference he had shown me over that basket of dry bread at his birthday dinner. The sound of the hot coffee splashing into my ceramic mug cut cleanly through his frantic yelling, a quiet but devastating reminder that I was completely unbothered by his ruin. As Darren collapsed into one of my dining chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands, a new sound interrupted the chaotic atmosphere. Abigail's phone began vibrating wildly inside her expensive designer purse. She had been standing silently by the shattered front door, watching her husband's empire disintegrate with wide, terrified eyes. She frantically dug through her bag and answered the call, desperately hoping for a lifeline from her own family. Instead, the shrill, hysterical crying of her mother, Diane, echoed loudly through the phone speaker. Diane was shrieking with such intense panic that her words were initially difficult to understand. Abigail demanded her mother calm down and explain what was happening. Through heavy, gasping sobs, Diane screamed that their incredibly luxurious summer house was currently surrounded by a fleet of heavily armored black corporate vehicles. She wailed that a dozen armed private security contractors had just marched onto their perfectly manicured lawn and completely blockaded the driveway. The security personnel were aggressively pounding on the front door, holding official legal documents and loudly demanding that Thomas and Diane vacate the premises immediately. Abigail dropped her designer purse onto the hardwood floor, her face draining of the last remaining drops of color. The arrogant, racist sneer she had proudly worn just minutes earlier completely vanished, replaced by a profound, suffocating dread. She slowly lowered the phone, her eyes locking onto my back as I continued to sip my coffee. She finally realized the terrifying scope of my retaliation. I had not merely targeted her husband's fraudulent business ventures. I had systematically targeted her family's stolen sanctuary, and the meticulously planned destruction of their entire high society existence was arriving exactly on schedule. The frantic race from my downtown apartment to the coastal summer estate took Darren and Abigail less than 40 minutes. Through the live video feed patched directly to my tablet from the security team on site, I watched my son aggressively swerve his luxury sedan onto the immaculate gravel driveway. He slammed on the brakes, sending a shower of white stones across the pristine landscaping. Abigail threw her car door open before the vehicle even completely stopped, sprinting across the manicured green lawn toward the chaotic scene unfolding near the grand entrance. Her parents, Thomas and Diane, were standing in the center of the yard, looking entirely out of place in their expensive resort wear, as they found themselves completely encircled by a dozen heavily armed, unsmiling private corporate security contractors. The men were dressed in tactical black uniforms, bearing the discreet but unmistakable insignia of my logistics empire. Thomas was aggressively waving his arms in the air. His face flushed a deep shade of crimson as he arrogantly ordered the security personnel to vacate his premises immediately. He pointed a trembling finger at the imposing lead guard, threatening to call the local police chief, whom he claimed was a close personal friend, to have the entire squad arrested for criminal trespassing. Diane clung to her husband's arm, weeping dramatically and demanding to know how these thugs had bypassed the gated community's security checkpoints. They were putting on a spectacular, indignant performance, utterly convinced of their untouchable ownership of the luxurious waterfront property. They truly believed their high society status made them immune to consequence. They were completely unaware that the ground they were so proudly standing on had never actually belonged to them. The lead security contractor did not flinch at Thomas's hysterical threats or Diane's theatrical sobbing. He stood perfectly still, his expression carved from stone, and calmly reached inside his tactical vest. He produced a thick, professionally bound legal folder and extended it toward Thomas. The guard advised Thomas to carefully review the certified property deed before attempting to contact any local law enforcement officers. Thomas snatched the folder with a harsh scoff, aggressively flipping the heavy parchment pages, while Darren and Abigail finally reached his side, panting and out of breath. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, preparing to smugly point out his own name on the official registry. Instead, his aggressive posture instantly deflated. The color rapidly drained from his face, as his eyes scanned the bold, undeniable legal text printed at the top of the notarized document. The deed clearly stated that the sprawling multi-million-dollar summer estate did not belong to him. The property was registered and fully owned by Sentinel Logistics, my primary corporate holding company. Thomas read the document a second time, his hands beginning to shake violently as the profound, suffocating reality of his situation set in. His arrogant facade shattered into pieces, replaced by absolute paralyzing confusion. He looked up at Darren, desperately demanding an explanation for why his son-in-law's corporate entity held the sole deed to his generational family home. Darren stared blankly at the paperwork, his mind short-circuiting as he recognized the official seal of my private wealth manager on the final page. My son finally realized that the endless financial safety net he had taken for granted extended far deeper into his wife's family than he had ever comprehended. The luxurious life they were all so desperately clinging to was an absolute mirage. They were staring at the exact paperwork I had authorized from my private office precisely 2 years ago. At that time, Thomas's supposedly brilliant retail investments had completely imploded, leaving him utterly bankrupt and facing immediate devastating public foreclosure on this very estate. He was about to lose everything and be permanently humiliated in front of the exact same high society circles he so desperately worshipped. I knew that if Abigail's family suffered a catastrophic public financial ruin, the toxic stress and immense shame would completely destroy Darren's marriage. Despite my personal misgivings about her character, I wanted my son to be happy and secure in his chosen life. So, I stepped in silently to solve the problem without bruising their fragile egos. I instructed Bradley to utilize a blind corporate trust to quietly purchase the massive debt directly from the bank. I fully paid off the overdue mortgage and legally transferred the estate's deed into the vast anonymous portfolio of Sentinel Logistics. I allowed Thomas and Diane to continue living in the luxurious home, rent-free, hiding my massive generosity behind impenetrable corporate anonymity. I never told my son what I had done, and I certainly never expected a single word of gratitude from his arrogant in-laws. I simply wanted to maintain the peace and protect my family from the harsh humiliation of poverty that I had worked my entire life to escape. I handed them a priceless sanctuary on a silver platter, and they repaid my quiet grace by serving me dry bread and attempting to lock me in an asylum. My silent protection was officially revoked, and the sheer weight of their unearned entitlement was about to crush them. A heavy silence fell over the manicured lawn, as Thomas, Diane, Abigail, and Darren stared at the undeniable proof of their manufactured reality. That fragile silence was abruptly broken by the low, powerful purr of a heavy engine turning onto the gravel path. A sleek black luxury town car pulled smoothly into the long driveway, navigating past the blockading security vehicles with deliberate, unhurried precision. The car came to a slow, silent stop directly behind Darren's parked sedan. The entire group turned to watch as the dark-tinted window of the rear passenger door slowly rolled down. I sat comfortably in the back seat, wearing the exact same faded corduroy jacket they had so ruthlessly mocked at the birthday dinner. The arrogant sneers they had worn at that restaurant were completely gone, replaced by expressions of sheer, unadulterated terror as they finally understood the absolute scale of my retaliation. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional explanation for my presence. I simply reached through the open window and handed a crisp, freshly stamped legal document directly to the lead security guard. It was an official immediate eviction notice authorized by the state Supreme Court. I looked past the trembling figures of Thomas and Diane, bypassing Abigail's horrified stare, and locked eyes directly with my son. The terrified boy standing on the lawn was a complete stranger to me now. I leaned slightly toward the open window, keeping my tone perfectly even and terrifyingly cold. I informed Darren that the holding company was officially liquidating all unnecessary assets. I told him he and his treacherous family had exactly 1 hour to pack their personal belongings before the guards physically removed them from my property. I rolled the window back up, sealing them outside in the bitter reality of their absolute ruin. The tinted window of my town car slid upward with a quiet mechanical hum, entirely severing my son from the financial sanctuary he had so ruthlessly exploited. Driven by sheer unadulterated panic and the terrifying specter of immediate homelessness, Darren and Abigail completely abandoned her bewildered parents on the manicured lawn. They sprinted toward Darren's luxury sedan, their movements jerky and frantic, totally devoid of the polished high society grace they usually projected. Through the tracking software Bradley had discreetly installed on their corporate vehicles, I watched the digital blip representing their car speed recklessly away from the coastal estate. They were racing against the ticking clock of the banking hours, desperately trying to salvage the $2 million offshore wire transfer I had silently intercepted at dawn. Darren drove them directly into the gritty heart of the city, pulling violently into a sprawling, dilapidated commercial strip mall that sat in stark contrast to the upscale neighborhoods they usually frequented. They parked hastily in front of a shady, dimly lit storefront, displaying a flickering neon sign advertising immediate legal and notary services. Their frantic, misguided plan was incredibly simple and profoundly illegal. They intended to heavily bribe a morally flexible public notary to officially backdate the fraudulent corporate loan documents. They foolishly believed that presenting freshly notarized, backdated paperwork to the International Banking Commission would somehow legally bypass the comprehensive financial freeze I had placed on the subsidiary accounts. They were acting out of pure suffocating desperation, operating under the delusion that a cheap strip mall shortcut could somehow override a massive federal banking blockade. This reckless, impulsive behavior was entirely consistent with the deeply flawed character Darren had developed over his lifetime. He had always taken the easy, corrupt way out of any difficult situation, completely shielded from the harsh consequences of his actions by the vast wealth I had accumulated. While I was tirelessly working brutal 70-hour weeks, fighting relentlessly against deeply entrenched systemic racism to secure federal logistics contracts for a young African-American entrepreneur, my son was living a life of absolute, unquestioned privilege. He never had to sweat for a single dollar or endure the crushing anxiety of an impending eviction. During his prestigious private high school years, he routinely used his generous allowance to quietly pay his underprivileged classmates to write his complex term papers and complete his difficult exams. He never actually learned the foundational values of integrity, discipline, or honest labor. He viewed rules, regulations, and laws as minor inconveniences designed solely to control poor people, firmly believing that his inherited wealth granted him total immunity from accountability. He was now approaching a massive, multi-million-dollar incident of federal corporate fraud with the exact same juvenile entitled arrogance. He used to cheat on a high school history essay. He legitimately thought he could simply buy his way out of a catastrophic felony charge by sliding a few crumpled bills across a dirty counter. He lacked the fundamental maturity to understand that the federal banking authorities and elite corporate investigators did not operate like easily intimidated high school teachers. The interior of the dingy notary office was bathed in the harsh, unflattering glow of buzzing fluorescent lights. Darren and Abigail marched up to the scratched plexiglass counter, their designer clothing looking entirely absurd in the dreary, cramped environment. Sitting behind the desk was a quiet, unassuming man wearing a rumpled shirt and thick reading glasses. Darren aggressively slapped the forged loan documents onto the counter, immediately followed by a thick stack of emergency cash he had kept hidden in his vehicle's glove compartment. He leaned over the barrier, speaking in a harsh, demanding tone, explicitly ordering the man to stamp the official seals immediately. Darren aggressively instructed the notary to backdate the critical signatures by 48 hours and explicitly demanded that he ask absolutely no questions regarding the digital authorizations or the missing corporate witnesses. Abigail did not stand by her husband's side to offer support. She paced frantically back and forth near the smudged glass of the front door, sweating profusely through her expensive silk blouse. She was obsessively checking her smartphone constantly, refreshing her mobile banking application, absolutely terrified that the international wire transfer window was rapidly closing. Her manicured fingers trembled violently as she gripped the device, her eyes darting between the street outside and the transaction occurring at the counter. The heavy, suffocating tension of their impending ruin filled the tiny room thick enough to cut with a knife. They were gambling the entire remainder of their freedom on the assumption that every single working-class person had an easily accessible price tag. The quiet man behind the counter looked down at the forged logistics documents and then looked at the heavy stack of $100 bills resting near his keyboard. He did not object to the aggressive demands or question the highly suspicious nature of the backdated transaction. He simply nodded, reaching a steady hand toward his heavy brass official stamp. He aligned it carefully over the fraudulent signature lines and brought it down with a loud, definitive thud that echoed sharply against the cheap linoleum walls. Darren let out a massive, shuddering sigh of profound relief, his shoulders dropping as he believed he had just successfully circumvented the total freeze on the Blackwood Trust. He reached out to snatch the freshly notarized documents, entirely convinced that his juvenile bribery had just secured his $2 million offshore escape. But his hand stopped midair when the man behind the counter suddenly smiled. It was not the subservient, grateful smile of a bribed clerk, but a cold, highly professional expression of absolute victory. The man calmly slid the stack of bribe money directly into a clear tamper-evident evidence bag. He then casually removed his thick reading glasses and reached a finger up to his ear, explicitly tapping a discreet high-tech communication earpiece hidden neatly inside his collar. The man was not a greasy, corrupt strip mall notary. He was a highly trained, undercover operative working directly for Bradley's elite private investigative firm. The entire dingy office was heavily wired, with hidden cameras and microphones that had just flawlessly captured their desperate federal bribery and premeditated document forgery on high-definition tape. The invisible steel trap I had meticulously set finally snapped completely shut. Completely oblivious to the fact that his desperate strip mall bribery had just been permanently recorded by undercover federal operatives, Darren orchestrated his final fatal maneuver. He drove straight from the dingy notary office to the towering glass headquarters of Sentinel Logistics and immediately convened an emergency meeting of the executive board. His mind was racing, fueled by pure adrenaline and the terrifying reality of his frozen corporate accounts. Darren intended to execute a massive, unauthorized liquidation of his remaining minority shares in the subsidiary company. He had secretly contacted an aggressive foreign acquisition firm hours earlier, promising them a heavily discounted buy-in rate in exchange for an immediate, untraceable offshore cash wire. He desperately needed this massive influx of liquid capital to hire an elite criminal defense team and to flee the jurisdiction before the domestic banking authorities officially indicted him for wire fraud. The corporate boardroom was incredibly tense, filled with senior executives and operations directors who had spent decades building this company alongside me. They murmured quietly among themselves, deeply suspicious of Darren's frantic, unannounced gathering and the sudden presence of international acquisition lawyers dialing into the large conference monitors. Darren paced at the head of the long mahogany table, completely ignoring the bewildered stares of the loyal logistics directors. He aggressively slapped the freshly stamped, of backdated loan documents onto the polished wood, falsely claiming that his father had suffered a sudden cognitive collapse and granted him full executive authority to restructure the subsidiary's ownership. He was moving with the reckless, uncoordinated speed of a cornered predator, entirely convinced that his forged paperwork and the impending arrival of the foreign buyer's local representative would secure his permanent escape from absolute financial ruin. Abigail stood rigidly by her husband's side, projecting a hollow, icy confidence that starkly contrasted with the sheer, unadulterated panic she had displayed in the auto dealership just hours prior. She had quickly reapplied her expensive designer makeup and smoothed her silk blouse, fiercely determined to maintain her aristocratic facade until the very last second. She crossed her arms defensively over her chest and glared down her nose at the loyal, hard-working department heads seated around the heavy table. She treated these seasoned logistics veterans with absolute undisguised contempt, acting as if she still controlled their salaries, their pensions, and their livelihoods. She wanted to ensure everyone in the room understood that she considered herself royalty, entirely above the working-class people who actually generated the wealth she was currently attempting to steal. Darren finally stopped his frantic pacing and took his seat in the oversized leather executive chair at the head of the table. He deliberately smoothed his silk tie, projecting the highly artificial image of a seasoned corporate titan preparing to execute a brilliant masterstroke. He pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it carefully next to the fraudulent transfer agreements. He was fully prepared to casually sign away the decades of sweat, tears, and relentless sacrifice I had poured into building this corporate empire. He did not care about the hundreds of warehouse workers and drivers who would lose their health care. The sacrifice I had poured into building this corporate empire. He did not care about the hundreds of warehouse workers and drivers who would lose their health care if the subsidiary was suddenly cannibalized by a hostile foreign entity. He only cared about saving his own skin and securing enough stolen capital to maintain his luxurious delusion. They both stared intently at the heavy double doors at the end of the room, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the foreign representative who would finalize their grand theft. Darren's entire frantic scheme relied on a fundamental, highly arrogant misunderstanding of how I had meticulously structured my business from its very inception. When I first established Sentinel Logistics over 40 years ago, I was a young African-American entrepreneur navigating a deeply hostile, predatory corporate landscape. I learned very early on that corporate sharks and corrupt banking institutions would constantly attempt to exploit, dilute, or outright steal the equity of minority business owners through complex legal loopholes and hostile takeovers. To permanently protect my family and my dedicated employees from that exact vulnerability, I mandated a highly specific, legally unbreakable clause within the foundational corporate charter. The absolute legal architecture of the holding company explicitly dictated that absolutely no shares, regardless of minority or majority status, could ever be liquidated, sold, or transferred without the physical in-person signature of the original founder. Digital authorizations, stamped notary approvals, and remote proxy signatures were entirely invalid for the transfer of corporate equity. I built that ironclad fail-safe into the very DNA of the corporation, specifically to prevent a greedy board of directors or a reckless, entitled heir from destroying the company behind my back. Darren had spent his entire adult life enjoying the lavish fruits of my labor, but he had never actually bothered to read the foundational legal documents that generated his immense wealth. He operated under the childish assumption that possessing the title of a subsidiary director granted him ultimate unchecked authority over the corporate treasury. I was preparing to sell a massive portion of the company using documents that were fundamentally worthless, entirely ignorant of the fact that the legal trap he was trying to escape had been fortified against his exact brand of treason decades before he was even born. The digital clock on the boardroom wall clicked to exactly noon. Darren lifted his gold pen, his hand trembling slightly with a toxic mixture of terror and anticipation, ready to execute the final signature the moment the buyer walked into the room. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the executive suite did not open with the polite, measured push of a visiting international investor. They swung open violently, slamming hard against the interior walls and instantly silencing every single murmur in the room. The expected foreign representative did not walk through the threshold. I walked into the room. I moved with slow, deliberate authority, wearing the exact same faded corduroy jacket they had so mercilessly mocked at the birthday dinner. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. Darren dropped his pen, the heavy gold cylinder clattering loudly against the polished wood as the last remaining drop of blood drained completely from his face. Abigail gasped loudly, taking a sudden, unsteady step backward until her spine hit the glass windows. I did not come alone. I was flanked tightly on my right by Bradley, who carried a thick stack of certified forensic audit reports. Standing directly to my left was the quiet, unassuming man in the rumpled shirt they had just explicitly bribed at the strip mall, no longer hiding his identity as a premier corporate investigator. Following closely behind them were two fully uniformed federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, their hands resting securely on their utility belts. The ultimate reckoning had finally arrived, and the locked doors of the boardroom officially transformed Darren's arrogant emergency meeting into a devastating, inescapable federal trap. I stepped fully into the executive boardroom, entirely ignoring the stunned collective gasps of the senior directors who had gathered around the massive mahogany table. They stared in absolute shock as I bypassed the guest chairs and walked with deliberate, unyielding purpose toward the head of the table. Darren was completely paralyzed, still clutching his heavy gold fountain pen, his mouth hanging open in silent, suffocating terror. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge his mounting panic. I simply stood beside him, reached into Bradley's leather briefcase, and pulled out the freshly stamped backdated loan documents he had just desperately notarized at the strip mall. I placed the fraudulent paperwork directly onto the polished wood, sliding it right in front of my son's trembling hands. The sharp, heavy slap of the paper hitting the table echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. This was the undeniable, physical proof of his profound corporate treason, resting in plain sight for the entire executive board to witness. Darren looked down at the forged signatures and the fake notary stamp, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He finally understood that his reckless flight across the city had been completely monitored, and his pathetic attempt to bypass the frozen accounts had been meticulously orchestrated by my investigative team. The undercover notary stepped forward from the doorway, calmly removing his thick glasses and standing shoulder to shoulder, with the federal agents cementing the absolute finality of the trap. Darren was completely cornered, stripped of his stolen authority, and utterly exposed as a desperate criminal in front of the very people he had just attempted to betray. The crushing reality of the federal raid shattered Abigail's icy aristocratic facade in an instant. She immediately attempted a frantic, humiliating retreat, rapidly shifting from a posture of arrogant superiority to a sickening display of manufactured innocence. She forced a high, nervous laugh that bounced awkwardly off the glass walls, frantically waving her hands as if she could physically brush away the severe criminal charges looming over them. She took a step toward me, plastering a fake, desperate smile across her face, and loudly claimed that this entire situation was just a terrible, unfortunate family misunderstanding that had gotten wildly out of hand. She explicitly begged me to dismiss the uniformed federal agents waiting by the door, pleading that we should step into a private office to handle our domestic disagreements like civilized adults. She tried to charm her way out of a guaranteed prison sentence, batting her eyes and speaking in a sweet, trembling voice that she usually reserved for manipulating high society gala hosts. She completely ignored the blatant, undeniable evidence of corporate fraud sitting on the table, desperately trying to convince the stunned board members that Darren was merely stressed and making impulsive mistakes. Abigail pleaded with me to remember that we were family, twisting her words to make it seem as though my retaliation was an extreme, unreasonable overreaction to a minor financial error. She thought she could easily manipulate an elderly man's emotions, fully expecting me to fold under the pressure of a public scene and protect my son from the harsh consequences of his actions. She wildly underestimated my resolve. I looked directly into Abigail's panic-stricken eyes and watched her force perfectly shaped tears down her cheeks. I felt absolutely no pity for her sudden distress. As she stood there begging for familial mercy, my mind briefly flashed back to the exact moment she had coldly decided I was not worthy of joining their family in the first place. I remembered sitting in my living room years ago listening as she bluntly refused to invite me to their lavish wedding ceremony. She had looked at my calloused hands that had bled and blistered for decades to build the very wealth she was marrying into, and told Darren that my quiet working-class demeanor simply did not fit the aesthetic of her exclusive high-society venue. She explicitly stated that my presence would embarrass her wealthy parents and ruin the sophisticated atmosphere of her special day. Darren had cowardly agreed, leaving me sitting alone while they celebrated their union using my corporate dividends. Abigail had spent her entire marriage treating me like an invisible, shameful burden, only acknowledging my existence when she needed to siphon more capital from the subsidiary accounts. She possessed no genuine love for my son, and absolutely no respect for the sacrifices I made to secure his future. Her current tears were not born of remorse or a sudden realization of her moral failures. She was only crying because her limitless bank account had been forcefully closed and she was terrified of losing her designer wardrobe. I remained perfectly still, watching her pathetic performance, knowing that the consequences she was about to face were entirely earned. I did not entertain her desperate pleas or offer a single word of comfort. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a sleek digital tablet. I activated the screen, turned the volume to its maximum setting, and slid the device directly across the mahogany table until it stopped right in front of Darren and Abigail. The high-definition video began to play, immediately broadcasting the flawless security footage from my downtown apartment to the entire executive board. The room watched in absolute horrified silence as the recording clearly displayed Darren violently kicking my dining chair and explicitly threatening to forge medical incompetency documents. The audio captured every single vicious, racially charged threat Abigail had proudly delivered, echoing her exact promises to manipulate the police and falsely lock me inside a psychiatric asylum. The seasoned executives around the table gasped in genuine disgust, completely appalled by the profound cruelty and undeniable malice recorded on the screen. The footage systematically destroyed any remaining illusion of a simple family misunderstanding, exposing Darren and Abigail as ruthless, calculating predators attempting to steal a corporate empire through intimidation and fraud. The undeniable proof of their extortion hung heavily in the air, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or denial. As the video concluded, I gave a brief, decisive nod to the men waiting by the heavy wooden doors. The two uniformed federal agents immediately stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet, and smoothly drew their steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The ultimate reckoning had officially arrived. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Darren's wrists echoed like a final devastating gavel strike through the cavernous boardroom. The distinct sound instantly shattered the last remaining remnants of his arrogant executive persona. He looked down at his restrained hands, his chest heaving as the crushing reality of his situation finally penetrated his profound delusion. I was no longer a wealthy logistics director, playing high-stakes games with a foreign buyer. He was a cornered felon facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud. Total unrestrained panic completely consumed him. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly seemed like a ridiculous costume on a terrified child. Desperation stripped away his loyalty in a fraction of a second. Darren wildly twisted his body toward Abigail, his eyes wide and manic. He'd pointed his bound hands directly at his wife and began screaming hysterically at the federal agents. He frantically declared that the entire embezzlement scheme was never his original plan. He yelled that Abigail had viciously manipulated him into draining the subsidiary accounts, specifically to rescue her parents from their suffocating bankruptcy. He painted himself as a naive, manipulated victim who only forged the documents because his wife constantly demanded more capital to fund her family's failing retail business and maintain her impossible high society standards. The facade of their united untouchable partnership completely evaporated under the terrifying threat of federal prison time. He was fully prepared to throw the woman he married directly under the bus to shave a few years off his impending sentence. Abigail did not shrink away from her husband's desperate, cowardly accusations. Instead, she retaliated with a terrifying, instantaneous fury. She lunged forward with blinding speed and slapped Darren directly across the face with an open palm. The sharp, violent smack resonated loudly in front of the stunned corporate directors and the alert federal agents. The sheer force of the blow snapped Darren's head to the side, leaving a bright red handprint blooming across his pale cheek. She did not care about the optics of physically assaulting a restrained man in the presence of law enforcement. Her aristocratic mask completely melted away, exposing a vicious, deeply ugly hatred that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for years. She leaned in close to his face, her voice dripping with absolute unfiltered venom. She screamed that he was a pathetic, weak failure who possessed absolutely no business acumen of his own. She viciously mocked his desperate attempts to play the powerful executive, declaring loudly that he could never even hope to step out from the immense, brilliant shadow cast by his highly successful father. She told the entire room that Darren was nothing but a fragile, incompetent imposter who had to steal his father's money because he was fundamentally incapable of generating a single dime of his own wealth. The perfectly curated, glamorous image they broadcast to their country club friends disintegrated into a grotesque, extremely public display of mutual loathing. They were completely tearing each other apart right in front of my eyes. Watching them viciously tear each other to shreds merely confirmed what I had quietly suspected since the very beginning of their relationship. Their marriage was never actually built on a foundation of genuine affection or mutual respect. It was always a completely hollow, parasitic transaction negotiated between two incredibly selfish people. Darren suffered from a profound inferiority complex, desperate to prove his worth in the elite circles that had historically excluded people who looked like us. He essentially purchased Abigail, securing a beautiful, connected trophy wife from a supposedly respectable family to artificially elevate his own social status. He believed marrying into her high society network would somehow validate his stolen executive title. In return, Abigail viewed my son as an endless, unquestioning bank account. She possessed absolutely no genuine love for the man she married. She simply saw an insecure, easily manipulated heir attached to a massive logistics empire that could permanently fund her extravagant lifestyle. They were two leeches feeding off each other's desperate insecurities, bound together exclusively by the stolen corporate wealth they were aggressively siphoning from my hard work. Without the luxury cars, the lavish summer estates, and the limitless credit cards to distract them, there was absolutely nothing keeping them together. The moment the financial pipeline was definitively severed, their transactional union instantly collapsed into pure, unadulterated hostility. They never truly loved each other, and they were currently proving it by viciously fighting for their own survival at the complete expense of their partner. The lead federal agent firmly grabbed Darren by the bicep, physically pulling him away from his enraged wife and marching him toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. Darren stumbled awkwardly, his head hanging low in absolute defeat as the reality of his destroyed life finally crushed him. As the agents escorted her husband out of the room, Abigail aggressively smoothed her designer blouse and lifted her chin, attempting to immediately reassemble her shattered dignity. She let out a haughty, arrogant scoff and confidently turned toward the exit, acting as though she were merely leaving a tedious social engagement. She loudly declared to the remaining executives that her husband's pathetic financial crimes were entirely his own doing, proudly claiming she had absolutely no active part in the corporate fraud or the forged banking documents. She truly believed her gender and her manufactured social status granted her immediate immunity from the federal investigation. She took 2 confident steps toward the hallway before Bradley stepped directly into her path. My wealth manager completely blocked the exit, his face devoid of any emotion as he reached into his leather briefcase. He smoothly pulled out a thick, certified legal document and pressed it directly against Abigail's chest. He calmly informed her that she was not free to leave the premises under any circumstances. Bradley handed her a separate, fully authorized federal warrant, explicitly naming her as a primary co-conspirator. The document detailed comprehensive charges of international wire fraud, felony extortion, and criminal conspiracy. Her arrogant smirk vanished instantly as 2 more federal agents stepped into the room to secure her wrists. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs, locking tightly around Darren's wrists, echoed like a final devastating gavel strike through the cavernous boardroom. The distinct sound instantly shattered the last remaining remnants of his arrogant executive persona. He looked down at his restrained hands, his chest heaving, as the crushing reality of his situation finally penetrated his profound delusion. He was no longer a wealthy logistics director, playing high-stakes games with a foreign buyer. He was a cornered felon facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud. Total unrestrained panic completely consumed him. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly seemed like a ridiculous costume on a terrified child. Desperation stripped away his loyalty in a fraction of a second. Darren wildly twisted his body toward Abigail, his eyes wide and manic. He pointed his bound hands directly at his wife and began screaming hysterically at the federal agents. He frantically declared that the entire embezzlement scheme was never his original plan. He yelled that Abigail had viciously manipulated him into draining the subsidiary account specifically to rescue her parents from their suffocating bankruptcy. He painted himself as a naive, manipulated victim who only forged the documents because his wife constantly demanded more capital to fund her family's failing retail business and maintain her impossible high society standards. The facade of their united, untouchable partnership completely evaporated under the terrifying threat of federal prison time. He was fully prepared to throw the woman he married directly under the bus to shave a few years off his impending sentence. Abigail did not shrink away from her husband's desperate courtly accusations. Instead, she retaliated with a terrifying, instantaneous fury. She lunged forward with blinding speed and slapped Darren directly across the face with an open palm. The sharp, violent smack resonated loudly in front of the stunned corporate directors and the alert federal agents. The sheer force of the blow snapped Darren's head to the side, leaving a bright red handprint blooming across his pale cheek. She did not care about the optics of physically assaulting a restrained man in the presence of law enforcement. Her aristocratic mask completely melted away, exposing a vicious, deeply ugly hatred that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for years. She leaned in close to his face, her voice dripping with absolute unfiltered venom. She screamed that he was a pathetic, weak failure who possessed absolutely no business acumen of his own. She viciously mocked his desperate attempts to play the powerful executive, declaring loudly that he could never even hope to step out from the immense, brilliant shadow cast by his highly successful father. She told the entire room that Darren was nothing but a fragile, incompetent imposter who had to steal his father's money because he was fundamentally incapable of generating a single dime of his own wealth. The perfectly curated, glamorous image they broadcast to their country club friends disintegrated into a grotesque, extremely public display of mutual loathing. They were completely tearing each other apart right in front of my eyes. Watching them viciously tear each other to shreds merely confirmed what I had quietly suspected since the very beginning of their relationship. Their marriage was never actually built on a foundation of genuine affection or mutual respect. It was always a completely hollow, parasitic transaction negotiated between two incredibly selfish people. Darren suffered from a profound inferiority complex, desperate to prove his worth in the elite circles that had historically excluded people who looked like us. He essentially purchased Abigail, securing a beautiful, connected trophy wife from a supposedly respectable family to artificially elevate his own social status. He believed marrying into her high society network would somehow validate his stolen executive title. In return, Abigail viewed my son as an endless, unquestioning bank account. She possessed absolutely no genuine love for the man she married. She simply saw an insecure, easily manipulated heir attached to a massive logistics empire that could permanently fund her extravagant lifestyle. They were two leeches feeding off each other's desperate insecurities, bound together exclusively by the stolen corporate wealth they were aggressively siphoning from my hard work. Without the luxury cars, the lavish summer estates, and the limitless credit cards to distract them, there was absolutely nothing keeping them together. The moment the financial pipeline was definitively severed, their transactional union instantly collapsed into pure, unadulterated hostility. They never truly loved each other, and they were currently proving it by viciously fighting for their own survival at the complete expense of their partner. The lead federal agent firmly grabbed Darren by the bicep, physically pulling him away from his enraged wife and marching him toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. Darren stumbled awkwardly, his head hanging low in absolute defeat as the reality of his destroyed life finally crushed him. As the agents escorted her husband out of the room, Abigail aggressively smoothed her designer blouse and lifted her chin, attempting to immediately reassemble her shattered dignity. She let out a haughty, arrogant scoff and confidently turned toward the exit, acting as though she were merely leaving a tedious social engagement. She loudly declared to the remaining executives that her husband's pathetic financial crimes were entirely his own doing, proudly claiming she had absolutely no active part in the corporate fraud or the forged banking documents. She truly believed her gender and her manufactured social status granted her immediate immunity from the federal investigation. She took 2 confident steps toward the hallway before Bradley stepped directly into her path. My wealth manager completely blocked the exit, his face devoid of any emotion as he reached into his leather briefcase. He smoothly pulled out a thick certified legal document and pressed it directly against Abigail's chest. He calmly informed her that she was not free to leave the premises under any circumstances. Bradley handed her a separate, fully authorized federal warrant, explicitly naming her as a primary co-conspirator. The document detailed comprehensive charges of international wire fraud, felony extortion, and criminal conspiracy. Her arrogant smirk vanished instantly as 2 more federal agents stepped into the room to secure her wrists. The scene shifted abruptly from the chaotic corporate boardroom to the chilling, sterile confines of a holding cell deep inside the federal detention building. The heavy steel door groaned on its reinforced hinges as I stepped into the cramped interrogation room, leaving Bradley and the armed federal agents waiting quietly in the exterior hallway. The stark, buzzing fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving glare across the scratched metal table bolted firmly to the concrete floor. Sitting on the opposite side was my son, entirely stripped of the expensive tailored Italian suits he had purchased using my stolen company funds. Darren was now drowning in a stiff, brightly colored orange prison jumpsuit that looked completely absurd on his trembling frame. His wrists were secured tightly by thick metal chains anchored directly to the table, restricting his frantic, nervous movements. He was shivering violently, his perfectly styled hair now matted with cold sweat, his eyes wide and bloodshot from hours of relentless panic. I slowly pulled out the single metal chair on my side of the table and sat down, smoothing the lapels of my faded corduroy jacket. The visual contrast between us was absolute and profound. I was a man perfectly at peace, anchored by the unshakable foundation of my hard-earned legacy, wearing the modest clothing of my working-class roots. He was a broken, terrified imposter, a man who had flown far too close to the sun on stolen wings, now brutally grounded by the uncompromising weight of federal law. I did not speak a single word, allowing the suffocating, heavy silence of the concrete room to crush whatever remaining defiance he held. The oppressive silence rapidly broke Darren's fragile psyche. He suddenly leaned forward as far as the heavy chains would physically allow, launching into a pathetic, hysterical display of desperate begging. Tears streamed freely down his pale face as he cried uncontrollably, violently sobbing, as he begged me for absolute forgiveness. He frantically promised to spend the rest of his natural life working in my distribution warehouses for absolutely free, aggressively swearing he would drive delivery trucks, scrub the loading dock floors, and surrender every single paycheck until every last stolen cent was repaid to the corporate treasury. He wildly offered to sign any legally binding contract Bradley could draft, practically choking on his own tears as he pleaded to be saved from a lengthy federal prison sentence. When my expression remained entirely frozen and unresponsive to his desperate financial bargains, Darren immediately pivoted to a far more insidious manipulative tactic. He attempted to weaponize his status as my only living child, desperately trying to leverage my profound, lingering grief over Valerie's death to secure his immediate release. He explicitly invoked his late mother's name, screaming that Valerie would be absolutely horrified to see her only beloved son locked away in a concrete cell like a common criminal. He weaponized a dead woman's sacred memory, maliciously attempting to manipulate my deepest emotional vulnerabilities to shield himself from legal accountability. He cried out that I was destroying the very last remaining piece of my family, begging me to withdraw the comprehensive financial evidence and instruct my attorneys to drop the federal charges before his life was permanently ruined. I stared blankly across the cold steel table at my weeping son, completely immune to his calculated theatrical display of emotional extortion. As he desperately invoked his mother's name, my mind drifted backward, recalling the countless, exhausting times I had quietly bailed Darren out of severe trouble during his privileged teenage years. I remembered the late-night phone calls from elite private school administrators regarding extensive property damage, the exorbitant legal fees I paid to quietly bury his reckless driving incidents, and the massive financial settlements I authorized to permanently scrub his record clean before college. As an African-American father who had survived the brutal, unforgiving realities of systemic prejudice, I was absolutely terrified of letting my son fall into the merciless jaws of the criminal justice system. I aggressively wielded my immense corporate wealth as an impenetrable shield, deeply determined to protect my boy from ever experiencing the harsh, deeply prejudiced consequences of the real world. In that sterile interrogation room, a profound, agonizing realization washed over me. By providing Darren with an absolute consequence-free vacuum and endlessly deploying my financial safety nets to erase his reckless mistakes, I had actively prevented him from developing a functional moral compass. My relentless, unconditional protection had inadvertently manufactured this deeply entitled parasitic monster sitting across from me. I had shielded him from minor discomforts, and in doing so, I had fully enabled him to confidently commit massive federal fraud. The profound sadness I felt was not for the terrified criminal begging for mercy, but for the fundamental failure of my own misguided parental leniency. I did not raise my voice, nor did I deliver a passionate, angry lecture about his monumental betrayals. I simply let him exhaust his frantic, manipulative sobbing until his cries reduced to pathetic, rhythmic gasps for air. I reached calmly into the interior breast pocket of my faded jacket and slowly withdrew a single high-resolution, glossy photograph. The image had been discreetly captured by one of Bradley's elite private investigators, who had closely monitored the upscale restaurant just days prior. I placed the photograph face up on the cold steel table and slid it deliberately toward Darren's chained hands. It was a perfectly framed picture of the lavish birthday dinner. The image clearly displayed Thomas and Diane eagerly feasting on expensive garlic-buttered king crab legs, while the pathetic, insulting wicker basket of cold, dry dinner rolls sat isolated in front of my empty place setting. Darren looked down at the photograph, his tear-streaked face freezing as he recognized the exact moment he had proudly chosen his new wealthy in-laws over the father who had given him everything. The undeniable proof of his profound foundational disrespect lay right before his eyes. I looked directly into his terrified, unblinking stare and delivered my final verdict with absolute chilling finality. "You made your choice at that table," I told him, my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of mercy. "Now, you will eat the consequences." I stood up smoothly, adjusted my jacket, and turned my back on my only son. I walked out of the room, leaving the heavy metal door to slam shut behind me, completely sealing Darren inside with his desperate echoing sobs. The morning after I walked out of that freezing interrogation room, the devastating news of the high-profile arrests officially hit the national financial press. The front pages of every major business publication featured striking side-by-side photographs of Darren and Abigail being escorted out of the logistics headquarters in heavy steel handcuffs. The scandalous story of a prominent corporate executive and his socialite wife orchestrating a massive, multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme immediately captivated the public, desperate to protect their rapidly disintegrating social standing. Abigail's parents, Thomas and Diane, hastily organized an emergency press conference. They set up a podium directly on the pristine marble steps of their highly exclusive gated country club, standing before a dense crowd of eager local reporters and flashing camera lenses. They wore somber, meticulously tailored dark clothing, attempting to project the solemn dignity of deeply wronged aristocrats. Instead of defending their daughter or offering any semblance of familial loyalty, they ruthlessly threw her to the wolves to save their own reputations. Thomas gripped the edges of the podium and publicly disowned Abigail on live television. He aggressively declared that he and his wife were entirely innocent, unsuspecting victims of Darren's insidious financial manipulation. Diane stood beside him, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, nodding fervently as her husband spun a cowardly manufactured narrative. They claimed they had absolutely no idea that the immense influx of capital saving their failing retail business was derived from stolen corporate funds. They shamelessly painted themselves as trusting, naive parents who had been viciously deceived by a predatory son-in-law and a deeply misguided daughter, completely searing their familial ties the exact moment the money ran dry. Watching Diane perform her theatrical weeping victim routine on the television screen triggered a profound, deeply buried memory of the sheer, unadulterated contempt she had always harbored for me. Diane had built her entire personal identity on a fragile, toxic foundation of perceived racial and class superiority. Despite the undeniable fact that my personal net worth vastly eclipsed her family's dwindling generational wealth, she consistently viewed me as fundamentally beneath her. During the very few social engagements we were forced to share over the years, she regularly mocked the modest working-class neighborhood, where I proudly maintained my apartment. She would openly refer to my community as a dangerous slum, loudly complaining about the lack of upscale amenities and sneering at the hard-working, diverse African-American families who lived there. She possessed a deeply ingrained, sickening belief that a black man, regardless of his immense corporate achievements or financial magnitude, could never truly belong in her pristine, aristocratic world. She happily accepted the massive anonymous corporate bailouts that saved her retail business, but she refused to ever show basic human respect to the man whose labor actually funded her luxurious existence. She operated under the deeply prejudiced delusion that her skin color and her country club affiliations granted her a divine right to exploit my resources without consequence. She truly believed that she was entirely untouchable, insulated by a society that would naturally defer to her refined, wealthy facade. She thought she could simply stand on the steps of her elite clubhouse shed, a few calculated tears, and effortlessly wash her hands of the massive federal felony she had knowingly profited from for years. I sat in the quiet comfort of my living room watching the live broadcast while on a secure conference call with Bradley and his elite legal team. We listened to Thomas loudly proclaim his absolute ignorance regarding the origins of his sudden financial rescue. The sheer shameless audacity of their public perjury was breathtaking, but it perfectly set the stage for our final devastating countermeasure. I instructed Bradley to immediately execute the next, highly anticipated phase of our comprehensive legal strategy. Within minutes of Thomas concluding his arrogant, deceitful speech, Bradley's team securely transmitted the complete, unredacted financial forensics audits directly to every major news outlet, investigative journalist, and federal prosecutor currently covering the corporate scandal. We did not merely release summaries or vague statements. We dumped a massive mountain of undeniable, heavily verified evidence. The comprehensive documents contain detailed banking logs, signed receipt confirmations, and explicit email chains that thoroughly linked Thomas and Diane to the stolen logistics capital. The exhaustive paper trail definitively proved that Abigail's parents were not naive, unsuspecting victims. They were fully complicit, highly active participants in the massive embezzlement scheme. The audits clearly highlighted multiple instances where Thomas explicitly requested larger, untraceable cash injections from Darren specifically to cover his mounting retail debts, fully knowing the funds were being illegally diverted from my corporate treasury. The released records also showcased Diane personally authorizing exorbitant country club membership renewals using the stolen corporate routing numbers. We systematically stripped away their manufactured innocence, providing the media with irrefutable concrete proof that they had knowingly, eagerly devoured the stolen fruits of my labor to maintain their artificial high society illusion. The immediate fallout of the released financial documents was spectacular, unfolding in real time right in front of the rolling television cameras. As Thomas attempted to wrap up the press conference and turn away from the podium, a chorus of smartphones suddenly buzzed across the dense crowd of gathered journalists. The reporters quickly scanned the explosive audits that had just flooded their inboxes. The atmosphere on the pristine country club steps shifted from polite curiosity to aggressive predatory interrogation in a fraction of a second. A prominent investigative reporter loudly interrupted Thomas's retreat, aggressively confronting him with the undeniable email records proving he had knowingly solicited stolen corporate funds. Thomas froze completely, his arrogant, dignified posture crumbling as dozens of journalists began shouting rapid-fire questions about his explicit involvement in the federal wire fraud conspiracy. Diane stopped her theatrical weeping, her face draining of all color as the harsh camera lights captured her absolute paralyzing panic. Before they could formulate a single defensive lie, the heavy brass doors of the clubhouse swung open violently. The general manager of the highly exclusive country club marched directly out onto the steps, his face flushed with profound institutional embarrassment. He did not wait for the broadcast to cut to a commercial break. The manager stepped squarely in front of the flashing cameras, loudly interrupting the chaotic press conference. He publicly announced that due to the severe, undeniable evidence of felony financial crimes currently circulating, Thomas and Diane's elite memberships were officially and permanently revoked. He coldly ordered them to vacate the private property, immediately securing their absolute irreversible humiliation on national television, while I watched the satisfying broadcast from the quiet sanctuary of my home. The heavy, uncompromising machinery of federal justice descended upon Darren and Abigail's downtown luxury penthouse. Precisely at 9 in the morning, I sat securely inside my parked town car across the bustling avenue, watching through tinted glass as a fleet of unmarked government vehicles and heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks blockaded the extravagant high-rise building. A dozen federal marshals, moving with brutal and systematic efficiency, bypassed the panicked concierge and commandeered the private elevators. Within minutes, the physical dismantling of my son's fraudulent empire commenced in plain view of the morning commuters. The marshals began wheeling out massive, carefully wrapped canvases of expensive modern art, loading the stolen masterpieces directly into the back of armored transport vans. Following closely behind the art handlers were officers carrying heavy, reinforced lockboxes containing the hundreds of thousands of dollars in designer jewelry Abigail had hoarded. The street-level spectacle escalated dramatically when the flatbed tow trucks engaged their hydraulic winches. The deafening grind of heavy steel chains echoed off the glass skyscrapers as 3 pristine imported sports cars were unceremoniously dragged out of the underground VIP parking garage. The sleek vehicles, purchased entirely with stolen corporate capital, were hoisted onto the trucks and strapped down like common impounded scrap. A dense, murmuring crowd of curious pedestrians and caffeinated office workers quickly gathered along the barricaded sidewalk, pointing and whispering as the undeniable reality of a massive federal asset forfeiture played out in real time. The luxurious, untouchable sanctuary Darren had built to insulate himself from the working class was being gutted piece by piece, stripped down to the bare, ugly truth of his monumental financial crimes. Abigail had miraculously secured bail late the previous night, but her temporary freedom only provided a front-row seat to her absolute destruction. She burst through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, her hair completely disheveled and her designer clothing rumpled from a sleepless night in a federal holding cell. She aggressively pushed past the building security, throwing a massive, entirely unhinged screaming tantrum directly on the public sidewalk. She clutched a single, monogrammed leather handbag to her chest as if holding onto a life preserver, shrieking vile curses at the stoic federal officers who ignored her completely. She demanded they release her vehicle, stomping her expensive heels against the concrete and throwing her arms in the air like a spoiled, petulant child denied a toy. The aristocratic, refined elegance she had weaponized against me at the restaurant had completely evaporated, revealing the hollow, ugly desperation underneath. The gathered crowd did not offer her a shred of sympathy. Instead, a sea of glowing smartphone lenses immediately surrounded her. Her former affluent neighbors, passing delivery drivers, and eager tourists gleefully recorded every single second of her hysterical sobbing breakdown. She desperately tried to shield her face with her handbag, screaming at the bystanders to stop filming, but she was entirely powerless to control the narrative. Her public humiliation was being instantly uploaded, shared and broadcasted across every corner of the digital world. The woman who had so arrogantly declared that my worn jacket would ruin her high society aesthetic was now permanently immortalized as a screeching, disheveled felon, throwing a pitiful tantrum in the street. Her social execution was absolute, broadcasted in brilliant high definition for the entire world to witness. I observed her frantic, tearful collapse without a single ounce of remorse or paternal sympathy. As a federal marshal carried a transparent evidence box containing a heavy diamond and platinum necklace out to the transport van, my mind focused entirely on the true cost of that specific piece of jewelry. I knew exactly where the capital for those diamonds had originated. Darren had viciously siphoned that money directly from the primary employee pension fund. He had stolen the hard-earned retirement security of the dedicated forklift operators, the long-haul drivers, and the warehouse managers who had loyally stood by my side for decades. Those men and women had broken their backs loading freight to build Sentinel Logistics, and my son had raided their futures to decorate his wife's neck for country club galas. Reclaiming these assets was never about executing a petty personal revenge. It was about pure, uncompromising justice. I built my corporate empire on a foundational promise of protecting the working-class people who trusted me with their livelihoods. Watching the federal marshals strip Abigail of her stolen treasures was the necessary restoration of order. Every seized sports car and confiscated painting represented a stolen pension being violently ripped back from the hands of an entitled parasite. I was meticulously balancing the corporate scales, ensuring that the devastating consequences of Darren's extreme arrogance fell squarely on his own shoulders, rather than crushing the innocent families who depended on my holding company. The cold satisfaction radiating in my chest was the profound peace of a protector actively neutralizing a severe existential threat to his people. I remained perfectly still in the quiet, climate-controlled comfort of my vehicle, sipping a thermos of dark roast coffee, while the federal raid slowly concluded across the avenue. The street was still buzzing with gossiping pedestrians and the flashing lights of the marshal's transport vans. The total destruction of Darren and Abigail's lavish illusion was a spectacular success, and my work for the morning was essentially finished. As I reached forward to turn the ignition key and instruct my driver to head back to the corporate headquarters, a sudden unexpected movement caught my eye. A figure detached from the lingering crowd of onlookers and began walking purposefully across the busy street, navigating through the halted traffic directly toward my parked town car. She approached the passenger side and knocked softly, almost timidly, against the dark, heavy tinted glass. I lowered the window just a few inches, analyzing her face. It was the young waitress from the upscale seafood restaurant. It was the exact same woman who had quietly attempted to sneak me a proper, respectable meal, while my son and his wife aggressively humiliated me over a basket of dry bread. Her name tag from that night read Maya. She was wearing a simple civilian coat, holding her hands tightly inside her pockets to ward off the morning chill. Her expression was a mix of intense nervousness and fierce, unmistakable determination. I rolled the window down, completely curious as to why this young woman had tracked me down amidst a federal asset seizure. She took a deep breath, looked me squarely in the eyes, and revealed that the disastrous birthday dinner was not the only thing she had witnessed that night. I lowered the window the rest of the way, allowing the crisp morning air to flood the quiet interior of my town car. Maya stood on the sidewalk, her hands trembling slightly, as she reached into the pocket of her simple wool coat. She pulled out a small encrypted black flash drive and held it out toward me. Her voice was perfectly steady despite the obvious nervousness in her posture, as she explained exactly why she had tracked me down through the chaotic crowd surrounding the federal raid. She revealed that the disastrous birthday dinner was not the only horrific event she had witnessed that evening. While she was quietly clearing the expensive dessert plates from the private dining room, she had overheard a deeply disturbing conversation. Abigail and Darren had retreated to a secluded corner of the restaurant, believing they were entirely alone, to explicitly outline their sinister legal strategy. Maya listened in absolute horror as they meticulously planned the corrupt medical ambush, openly discussing exactly how they intended to bribe a private physician to manufacture a fake dementia diagnosis and legally lock me inside a psychiatric asylum. Deeply disgusted by their profound cruelty and sheer arrogance, Maya did not simply walk away and ignore the situation. She pulled her smartphone from her apron pocket, hit record, and captured their entire malicious, premeditated conspiracy in crystal-clear audio. She explained that she had spent the last 2 days carefully transferring the heavy audio files onto the encrypted drive, fiercely determined to find a way to get the undeniable evidence directly into my hands before my son could execute his horrific plan. I carefully accepted the small digital drive, fully recognizing the immense legal weight of the audio files it contained. This recording was the absolute undeniable nail in the coffin for Abigail's desperate attempt to paint herself as an innocent, manipulated victim. I immediately reached into the interior pocket of my faded corduroy jacket and pulled out my leather checkbook, fully intending to write this incredibly brave young woman a massive financial reward for her invaluable service. Before my pen could even touch the crisp paper, Maya aggressively shook her head and held up her hands, completely refusing to accept a single dime. She looked me directly in the eyes and firmly stated that she simply wanted to do the right thing because she had recognized the profound, ugly disrespect I had endured at that dinner table. She explained that she watched Abigail shove that basket of dry bread toward me and immediately recognized the exact same toxic, arrogant entitlement that working-class people are forced to endure every single day. She did not record the conversation for a lucrative financial payout or a quick reward. She did it because her moral compass absolutely demanded it. I slowly put my checkbook away, deeply moved by her unwavering integrity. Looking at her determined, unyielding expression, I saw a striking, powerful reflection of my own youthful determination. She possessed the exact same fierce, uncorrupted fire that I had relied upon decades ago when I was just starting to build my logistics empire from the ground up, in a world completely saturated with predatory greed and hollow social climbers. This young woman stood as a rare, brilliant testament to genuine human decency. Her unwavering honesty instantly transported my mind back over 40 years, reminding me of the brutal, unforgiving days when I first established Sentinel Logistics. When I was just a young, ambitious African-American man trying to purchase my very first delivery truck, the traditional financial institutions aggressively slammed their heavy doors in my face. The polished, wealthy bank managers took one look at my skin color and my modest background and immediately denied my commercial loan applications without even reading my carefully drafted business proposals. I was completely locked out of the elite financial system, forced to rely entirely on the kindness, trust, and profound honesty of working-class strangers. My initial success was built entirely on the backs of neighborhood mechanics who deferred my repair bills, local warehouse managers who gave me a chance at securing minor freight routes, and ordinary people who judged me strictly by the quality of my labor rather than the contents of my bank account. Those difficult, exhausting early years taught me a permanent, invaluable lesson about human nature. I learned that true, unshakable character is never inherited through a massive trust fund or purchased at an exclusive country club. Genuine integrity is forcefully forged in the hot, unforgiving fires of daily struggle. Darren had been completely shielded from that necessary struggle, and it had mutated him into a hollow, entitled criminal. Maya, however, clearly understood the harsh realities of the world, and she had chosen to navigate them with absolute, uncompromising honor. I recognized immediately that she possessed the exact foundational grit that my holding company desperately needed to secure its corporate future. I securely placed the encrypted flash drive inside my jacket pocket, treating the digital evidence with the utmost respect. I looked back at Maya, shifting the heavy conversation away from the criminal conspiracy and asking her a very direct question about her future. I asked her what she was currently studying in college, noting the heavy academic textbook peeking out from the top of her worn canvas tote bag. She nervously adjusted her coat and mentioned that she was in her junior year, working exhausting double shifts at the upscale restaurant to independently fund her highly demanding degree in corporate finance. A genuine warm smile spread across my face for the first time in what felt like an absolute eternity. The sheer beautiful irony of the situation was absolutely perfect. the young, fiercely intelligent woman who had just single-handedly delivered the final piece of evidence to destroy my corrupt, entitled son, was actively training to enter the exact same financial world he had just thoroughly disgraced. I leaned slightly out of the open window and told her to hand in her immediate resignation to the arrogant manager of that pretentious seafood restaurant. I offered her a highly paid premier executive internship at the central headquarters of Sentinel Logistics right on the spot. I promised her that she would learn how to manage real massive corporate portfolios under the direct, daily guidance of Bradley and my senior financial directors. Maya's eyes widened in absolute shock, tears of profound gratitude instantly welling up as she eagerly accepted the incredibly life-changing opportunity. I rolled the tinted window back up, signaling my driver to pull away from the curb, leaving the chaotic federal raid entirely behind us. I had just permanently sealed a powerful new alliance, completely replacing the treacherous son I had lost with a brilliant young mind who actually deserved a seat at my table. The fallout from the spectacular federal raid moved swiftly from the public streets into the hushed, deeply confidential backrooms of the federal courthouse. Darren's high-priced defense attorney, a ruthless legal shark who had somehow been secured using the last remnants of Abigail's hidden emergency funds before the complete asset freeze, requested an urgent closed-door meeting with Bradley and me. We sat across a scarred oak table in a cramped negotiation room, completely devoid of the luxurious trappings my son had grown accustomed to. The defense attorney wasted no time on pleasantries, immediately launching into a highly calculated, aggressive negotiation strategy, designed to salvage whatever tiny fraction of Darren's life remained. He formally presented a comprehensive plea deal, aiming to completely avoid the absolute public humiliation of a highly publicized, drawn-out federal trial. The proposition was exceptionally straightforward, yet dripping with the exact same arrogant entitlement that had fueled my son's crimes. The defense team explicitly asked me to entirely drop the ruinous multi-million-dollar civil charges I had filed on behalf of the holding company. In exchange for my financial mercy, they promised that Darren would immediately submit a guilty plea for the lesser criminal charges of corporate mismanagement, completely avoiding a jury trial. The attorney leaned across the table, maintaining intense eye contact, and argued that a quiet, seamless resolution was in the best financial interest of Sentinel Logistics. He heavily implied that pursuing the full weight of the civil penalties would only force a deeply embarrassing, highly sensationalized media spectacle that would inevitably damage the pristine corporate reputation I had spent 4 decades meticulously building. He was actively attempting to weaponize my own fierce dedication to the company, hoping I would simply choose to protect my brand over pursuing absolute, unyielding justice against my own flesh and blood. Bradley sat rigidly beside me, his hands folded tightly over his leather briefcase, as he carefully processed the heavy implications of the proposed plea agreement. My wealth manager had stood loyally by my side through decades of ruthless corporate battles, and his primary instinct was always the absolute protection of my empire. Bradley leaned in close, lowering his voice to a quiet, measured whisper, and gently advised me to seriously consider accepting the defense attorney's calculated offer. He pragmatically warned me that engaging in a highly sensational, extremely public federal trial would inevitably drag our entire family name directly through the mud for months on end. The relentless, vicious news cycle would dissect every single painful detail of Darren and Abigail's treacherous conspiracy, transforming my personal heartbreak into cheap, daily tabloid entertainment. Furthermore, Bradley cautioned that rejecting the plea deal would subject me to a brutal, deeply invasive cross-examination by Darren's aggressive defense team. They would actively attempt to twist the narrative, maliciously painting me as a tyrannical, unforgiving father who had callously pushed his desperate son into committing corporate fraud. The defense would ruthlessly weaponize my vast wealth and my stoic demeanor against me in front of a jury trying to manufacture a shred of sympathetic, reasonable doubt for their client. The sheer, suffocating pressure to simply settle the matter quietly and avoid a grotesque public spectacle was incredibly immense. The attorney across the table recognized Bradley's hesitation and offered a smug, confident smile, entirely convinced that the innate corporate desire to protect the brand would ultimately override my burning demand for justice. They all assumed I would predictably choose the easiest, quietest path forward, completely failing to comprehend the profound moral boundary my son had violently crossed. I sat in the sterile, windowless negotiation room and stared deeply at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the oak table. As the defense attorney and Bradley silently waited for my definitive answer, I reflected on the immense, profound weight of my family name. The name I carried was not merely a corporate brand or a hollow high society title purchased with stolen funds. It was a sacred, resilient legacy, passed down directly from ancestors who had survived profound, horrific systemic hardships simply to exist. My grandparents had endured the brutal, unforgiving realities of segregation, breaking their backs in fields and factories just to ensure the next generation could stand a fraction of an inch taller. I had built Sentinel Logistics on that exact same foundation of unyielding integrity, fierce determination, and absolute uncompromising honor. We had never hidden our struggles in the dark, and we had never accepted cowardly backroom deals to escape the harsh light of reality. Darren had recklessly weaponized that proud historic name to secure fraudulent bank loans and finance his grotesque parasitic vanity projects. He had deeply disgraced the very legacy that had shielded him from the cruelties of the world. I realized with absolute, crystal clarity that quietly sweeping his monumental crimes under the rug to save face would be the ultimate betrayal of the people who had sacrificed everything for my success. I completely refused to let my son selfishly diminish our ancestral legacy by escaping accountability in the murky shadows of a confidential legal settlement. The integrity of my name demanded absolute transparency regardless of how painful or embarrassing the process would be for the corporate image. True honor is never preserved by burying the truth. It is secured by aggressively bringing it into the light. The heavy silence in the room stretched until the defense attorney confidently reached for his expensive pen, fully expecting me to sign the cowardly compromise. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I stood up slowly from the hard wooden chair, moving with a deliberate, towering authority that instantly completely commanded the cramped space. I carefully buttoned my faded corduroy jacket, the exact same jacket that Darren and Abigail had so viciously mocked over a basket of dry bread at that luxurious birthday dinner. I looked the high-priced defense attorney directly in the eye, my gaze absolutely devoid of any hesitation or familial mercy, and I rejected the proposed plea deal entirely. I firmly stated that I would not withdraw a single civil charge, nor would I accept a conveniently sanitized guilty plea for a lesser offense. I explicitly demanded a full, uncompromising, and highly public federal trial. I wanted every single agonizing detail of their breathtaking arrogance, their profound cruelty, and their malicious medical ambush meticulously exposed in the brutal, unforgiving light of day. I promised the stunned attorney that I would personally take the witness stand and ensure the jury heard the exact audio recordings of my son and his wife actively plotting to strip away my human rights and lock me inside a psychiatric asylum. I turned my back on the sputtering, panicked defense lawyer, signaling to Bradley that the negotiation was permanently concluded. I opened the heavy steel door of the negotiation room and stepped out into the bustling corridor of the federal courthouse, fiercely prepared to drag my son's monstrous betrayal into the center of the public arena for the entire world to witness. The absolute total destruction of Darren's carefully manufactured illusion was now irreversibly set in motion. The federal trial commenced exactly 3 weeks later inside a packed wood-paneled courtroom that smelled faintly of polished oak and impending ruin. Every single seat in the public gallery was occupied by eager journalists, curious onlookers, and former high society associates, desperate to witness the spectacular downfall of my son and his wife. Abigail was the very first defendant to take the witness stand, moving with a carefully calculated, fragile grace designed specifically to elicit maximum sympathy. She had abandoned her expensive designer blouses and flashy jewelry for a plain conservative gray dress, deliberately styling her hair to look somewhat unkempt. The moment she sat down and gripped the microphone, she launched into a masterful, highly theatrical performance. She immediately attempted to paint herself as a profoundly terrified, chronically abused wife who had been violently forced into absolute silence by Darren's tyrannical financial control. She looked directly at the jury box and forced large, perfectly timed tears to spill down her pale cheeks. She claimed in a trembling, breathy voice that Darren had completely isolated her from her family and threatened to leave her destitute if she ever questioned his corporate transactions or his forged banking documents. She spun a sickening, fabricated narrative of severe domestic manipulation, aggressively portraying my son as a ruthless mastermind who commanded her every move under the constant threat of total financial ruin. She cried beautifully for the captivated jury, dabbing her eyes with a simple tissue, while entirely erasing her own malicious role in the massive embezzlement scheme. Her performance was a stunning display of pure, unadulterated sociopathy, designed to throw her husband directly into the jaws of a federal prison sentence to secure her own freedom. Darren sat frozen at the heavy wooden defense table, his hands resting limply on the polished surface as he watched his wife completely and ruthlessly destroy his character in front of a federal judge. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit provided by his public defender, completely stripped of the arrogant swagger he had proudly displayed at the luxury auto dealership just weeks prior. His jaw hung slightly open, his eyes wide and bloodshot, unable to fully process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal occurring just a few feet away from him. He watched Abigail meticulously assassinate his reputation, listening in absolute paralyzed horror as the woman he had actively stolen millions of dollars to impress casually painted him as an abusive, tyrannical monster. The carefully constructed, glamorous delusion of their perfect high society marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of his eyes. Darren finally realized that Abigail possessed absolutely no genuine affection, loyalty, or basic human respect for him. She viewed him simply as a convenient disposable shield to absorb the devastating impact of the federal wire fraud charges. Every single time she sobbed into the microphone and pointed a trembling finger in his direction, another layer of his profound denial violently peeled away. He was forced to silently swallow the bitter, agonizing truth that he had sacrificed his relationship with his father, his prestigious corporate career, and his personal freedom for a parasitic partner who was currently weaponizing his love to orchestrate his permanent downfall. He sat utterly alone in a crowded room, drowning in the sudden crushing realization that his entire adult life had been an absolute humiliating lie. I sat in the front row of the gallery, maintaining a perfectly stoic expression as I observed the brutal execution of my son's spirit. Decades ago, when Darren was just a young boy accompanying me on early morning delivery routes, I painstakingly taught him that loyalty is the only currency that truly matters in both business and in life. I explained to him that, while money can easily be printed, lost, or stolen, a man's word and his unwavering dedication to the people who stand by his side in the dark are the absolute foundation of a meaningful legacy. I built Sentinel Logistics by fiercely protecting my loyal drivers and investing in the marginalized communities that the major banking institutions deliberately ignored. I showed him that genuine loyalty creates an impenetrable armor against the harsh, unforgiving realities of the corporate world. Darren completely ignored those vital, foundational lessons, choosing instead to aggressively chase the hollow, superficial validation of elite country clubs and aristocratic social circles. He abandoned the solid, unshakable loyalty of his father to blindly invest his entire soul into a toxic, parasitic transaction with Abigail. Now sitting at that lonely defense table, Darren was finally learning the horrific, agonizing cost of investing his absolute loyalty in the wrong person. He was experiencing the exact same brutal, suffocating betrayal that he had so casually inflicted upon me when he sided with his racist in-laws over a basket of dry bread. The profound, heartbreaking tragedy was that I could no longer deploy my vast resources to rescue him from the painful consequences of his own disastrous choices. Abigail confidently finished her dramatic weeping testimony and stepped down from the witness stand, casting a brief, triumphant glance toward her defense attorney. She genuinely believed her theatrical performance had successfully secured her innocence in the eyes of the captivated jury. The prosecuting attorney approached the judge's bench, briefly conferring with Bradley, who had been serving as the primary legal liaison for my holding company throughout the entire federal investigation. Bradley gave me a swift, subtle nod across the silent courtroom. The prosecutor turned sharply to address the judge, formally announcing that the state wished to call a final critical rebuttal witness to the stand to directly challenge the defendant's fabricated narrative of victimhood. The heavy wooden double doors at the absolute rear of the packed courtroom suddenly swung open with a loud, resounding thud. Every single head in the gallery turned instantly to witness the arrival. Walking slowly down the center aisle, flanked by two armed federal marshals, was Dr. Thorne. It was the exact same corrupt private physician who had aggressively attempted to manufacture my false dementia diagnosis during their horrific medical ambush. Dr. Thorne was not wearing handcuffs or an orange prison jumpsuit. He was wearing a sharp-tailored suit carrying a thick binder of explicit medical and financial documentation. The state had aggressively leveraged the massive, illegal gambling debts I had purchased to completely corner the disgraced physician. Recognizing his impending ruin, Dr. Thorne had fully flipped state's evidence, agreeing to testify comprehensively against Abigail and Darren in exchange for absolute total legal immunity. Abigail's triumphant, arrogant smirk vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror as the architect of her medical conspiracy approached the witness stand to permanently seal her fate. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Dr. Thorne as he walked slowly down the center aisle. He took the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore an official oath to tell the absolute truth. Protected entirely by his comprehensive immunity, deal with the federal prosecutors, the disgraced physician did not hold a single detail back. He leaned close to the microphone and systematically detailed the entire malicious conspiracy from its very dark inception. Hunt presented an undeniable trail of encrypted text messages, recorded phone calls, and forged medical drafts directly to the court. The most devastating revelation came when Thorne explicitly identified Abigail, not my son, as the primary calculating mastermind behind the forced psychiatric commitment plan. He testified that Abigail had aggressively recruited him, negotiated his corrupt fee, and explicitly instructed him on exactly how to manipulate the cognitive exam to ensure I would be permanently locked inside a medical asylum. She had personally drafted the fraudulent legal documents designed to immediately seize my holding company. As the undeniable evidence of her extreme malice echoed clearly through the silent courtroom, Abigail's carefully constructed victim facade completely crumbled into dust. She slumped down heavily in her chair, her face draining of all color as the members of the jury turned to glare at her in absolute unfiltered disgust. The jurors saw right through her fragile manufactured tears, recognizing her as a ruthless sociopathic predator who had willingly plotted the psychological destruction of an elderly man purely to fund her lavish lifestyle. Her defense attorney stopped taking notes, realizing the case was entirely unsalvageable. The meticulous trap I had set was now permanently sealed around her neck. The prosecuting attorney rested the state's case shortly after Dr. Thorne concluded his devastating hour-long testimony. The federal judge delivered her final instructions, and the jury retired to the deliberation room to weigh the immense mountain of forensic and audio evidence. They did not need to deliberate for long. Less than 2 hours later, the jury foreman handed the bailiff a folded piece of paper containing a unanimous verdict of guilty on absolutely all counts. Darren and Abigail were formally convicted of international wire fraud, felony extortion, criminal conspiracy, and attempted elder abuse. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely zero tolerance for privileged corporate predators, ordered the defendants to stand for their official sentencing. She looked down from her elevated bench and delivered a crushing, uncompromising judgment that permanently stripped them of their stolen aristocratic identities. She sentenced them both to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The judge explicitly ordered the total forfeiture of any remaining assets, officially liquidating their luxury vehicles, designer wardrobes, and offshore accounts to provide full immediate restitution to the holding company and the affected employee pension funds. She scolded them publicly, stating that their breathtaking greed and profound moral bankruptcy represented the absolute worst, most parasitic elements of modern society. Darren's knees visibly buckled as the immense weight of a 2-decade prison sentence crashed down upon his shoulders. Abigail let out a sharp, choked gasp, finally comprehending that her days of sipping expensive champagne at elite country clubs were definitively over. They were entirely stripped of their freedom, their stolen wealth, and their remaining dignity reduced to nothing more than federal inmates facing decades of cold concrete. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the crowded gallery, quietly absorbing the profound finality of the judge's crushing sentencing. I was wearing the exact same faded corduroy jacket I had worn to Darren's disastrous birthday dinner all those weeks ago. At that upscale seafood restaurant, Abigail and her arrogant parents had looked at the frayed cuffs and worn fabric and immediately dismissed me as a pathetic, poverty-stricken burden. They had laughed mockingly at my simple attire, arrogantly assuming my refusal to wear flashy designer labels was a clear, undeniable symptom of absolute financial failure and cultural inferiority. They completely failed to understand the deep personal history intricately woven into those very threads. I bought this jacket 40 years ago when I was a young African-American man relentlessly pounding the pavement fighting for absolute scraps in a deeply prejudiced logistics industry. I wore it during freezing midnight shifts at the loading docks and during brutal corporate negotiations where my sheer determination heavily outweighed my bank balance. The jacket was never a symbol of poverty. It was a physical manifestation of my unshakable foundation, my relentless grit, and my ultimate hard-fought victory over a hostile world. Sitting in that federal courtroom, surrounded by high-priced lawyers and shattered socialites, my worn jacket looked exactly like what it truly was. It was the heavy armor of a man who had survived unimaginable struggle and successfully built an empire that absolutely no one could steal. The superficial, flashy, tailored suits my son had purchased with stolen corporate money had failed him completely, while the simple fabric of honest, unyielding labor had shielded me perfectly through the entire storm. The sharp clang of heavy steel chains echoed loudly through the quiet courtroom as the federal bailiffs moved in to physically secure the prisoners. They clamped thick iron cuffs around Darren's wrists and ankles, strictly preparing to transport him directly to the federal processing facility to begin his 20-year sentence. As the armed guards grabbed his arms to forcefully march him down the center aisle, Darren suddenly stopped and dug his heels deeply into the carpet. He turned his head and looked back at the gallery, his bloodshot, tear-filled eyes searching desperately through the crowd for my face. He looked at me with a profound, shattering mixture of intense regret, absolute terror, and a final, pathetic plea for paternal rescue. He was still waiting for me to step forward to offer a final word of comfort, or to somehow miraculously deploy my vast wealth to reverse the severe consequences of his own actions. I did not stand up to comfort the convicted felon. I did not gloat over his total destruction, and I certainly did not offer him a warm, forgiving smile. I remained firmly seated, maintaining a cold, deeply stoic posture that offered absolutely no emotional refuge. I met his desperate, pleading stare with unwavering intensity. I simply gave him a single, brief, solemn nod. It was a firm acknowledgement of his absolute defeat and a final, silent confirmation that he had freely chosen his own devastating path. Darren's shoulders slumped in total agonizing resignation as the guards roughly yanked him forward, leading him through the heavy wooden doors and entirely out of my life. With that one silent, powerful gesture, I permanently closed the book on our relationship forever. Several months after the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary sealed my son away, I officially resumed full and absolute command of Sentinel Logistics. The atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters shifted entirely the moment I walked back into the executive suite. I did not waste a single hour settling in. I immediately initiated a massive, ruthless restructuring of the entire corporate hierarchy, systematically terminating every single corrupt manager and sycophant Darren had hired to insulate his fragile ego. In their place, I promoted the loyal, hard-working men and women who had been completely overlooked and disrespected during the arrogant tenure of my son. I elevated seasoned warehouse supervisors to regional directors and moved veteran dispatchers into executive planning roles, ensuring the company was guided by people who intimately understood the grueling reality of the supply chain. I added strict new oversight protocols to ensure that no single executive, regardless of their family name, could ever bypass the rigorous financial audits again. My absolute first priority, however, was the immediate stabilization of the employee pension fund. I directed the massive influx of capital recovered from the federal asset forfeitures directly back into the retirement accounts of my dedicated workforce. I personally held meetings at every major distribution center, standing before the drivers and loaders to guarantee that their financial futures were permanently secured. I wanted every single employee to know that the parasitic era of corporate embezzlement had been eradicated and the company had returned to its foundational principles of unwavering integrity and mutual respect. I spent my days walking the floors of the shipping hubs, shaking hands with the mechanics and logistics coordinators, rebuilding the profound trust that Darren had so carelessly shattered. Reclaiming my empire was not merely a matter of restoring profit margins. It was a deeply personal mission to restore the moral soul of Sentinel Logistics. With the corporate treasury fully stabilized and the internal hierarchy completely rebuilt, I turned my attention toward repairing the broader damage inflicted by the limitless greed of my son. I established a massive, highly endowed educational scholarship program funded entirely by my private holding company. This initiative was specifically designed to support brilliant, fiercely ambitious working-class students who possessed raw talent but completely lacked the financial backing to enter elite corporate spaces. I wanted to actively dismantle the exact same systemic financial barriers that had nearly suffocated my own ambitions decades ago. I personally selected Maya, the courageous young waitress from the seafood restaurant, as the inaugural recipient of the program. I moved her out of that demeaning service job and placed her directly into a premier executive internship at my central headquarters. Maya thrived spectacularly in her new corporate environment, navigating complex financial portfolios with a hungry, unyielding intelligence that constantly reminded me of my own youth. I spent hours every afternoon personally mentoring her, teaching her the intricate, ruthless strategies required to survive in the apex levels of international commerce. I watched her dismantle predatory vendor contracts with a sharp, calculated precision that left my senior directors in absolute awe. Investing my time and vast resources into the bright future of Maya allowed me to systematically transform my profound, lingering grief into a powerful, unstoppable engine for community empowerment. The deep, agonizing heartbreak of losing my only biological son to extreme greed slowly faded, replaced by the immense, quiet satisfaction of cultivating a new generation of honorable, exceptionally capable leaders. Maya proved every single day that true character is never inherited through a wealthy bloodline, but is consistently forged in the hot, unforgiving fires of honest struggle and unwavering moral courage. While I was actively utilizing my reclaimed fortune to elevate the hardworking people around me, the parents of Abigail were simultaneously experiencing the absolute crushing reality of their new circumstances. Stripped entirely of their stolen wealth and thoroughly humiliated on national television, Thomas and Diane were completely ostracized from the elite aristocratic circles they had spent their entire lives worshiping. The federal authorities aggressively seized their sprawling summer estate and systematically liquidated their remaining retail assets to pay off their monumental corporate restitution. They were forcefully evicted from their gated community and ultimately forced to relocate into a tiny, dilapidated, low-income apartment situated on the absolute farthest edge of the city. The profound poetic justice of their situation was undeniable. They were now permanently trapped in the exact same impoverished working-class neighborhoods they had so proudly and viciously mocked for decades. They had built their entire identities upon the superficial perception of racial and class superiority, viewing people like me as fundamentally beneath them. Now they were forced to stand in line at the same discount grocery stores they had previously ridiculed, experiencing the harsh, unforgiving bite of the very economic struggle they had so callously dismissed. Without the stolen corporate capital to mask their deep underlying resentments, their marriage rapidly deteriorated into a toxic, inescapable nightmare. I received regular updates from my private investigators detailing how Thomas and Diane spent their days arguing bitterly in their cramped, dimly lit living space, constantly blaming each other for their spectacular, extremely public downfall. They desperately attempted to contact their former high society friends, begging for emergency loans or minor social favors, but their calls were completely ignored. The wealthy, prejudiced country club elite who had once eagerly drank their expensive champagne now treated them like a highly infectious disease, entirely erasing them from their exclusive social registries. Their ruin was total, irreversible, and entirely of their own making. The absolute destruction of their artificial, greedy world provided a stark, beautiful contrast to the genuine, enduring peace I had finally secured for myself. Sitting alone in the quiet comfort of my downtown apartment, I reflected deeply on the long, arduous journey that had brought me to this exact moment. I realized with absolute crystal clarity that my true legacy was never defined by my biological bloodline or the sheer monetary magnitude of my inherited wealth. Darren had proven definitively that passing down millions of dollars to a child devoid of character only creates a highly destructive, entitled parasite. My true enduring legacy is defined by the lasting, profoundly positive impact I leave on the dedicated community that supported me when I was nothing but a young, exhausted man driving a single rusted delivery truck. I had spent 40 years fighting relentlessly against predatory banking systems and systemic prejudice, and I had successfully built a fortress that protected thousands of hardworking families. I did not allow the monumental betrayal of my son to harden my heart or destroy the work of my life. Instead, I surgically excised the rot from my empire and utilized my vast power to uplift those who genuinely deserved a seat at the table. I had reclaimed my dignity by refusing to be a silent victim of familial abuse, demonstrating that true power requires both immense strength and unwavering moral clarity. The fortune I amassed will not be squandered on frivolous luxury or inherited by ungrateful heirs. It will continue to serve as a vital engine for opportunity and equality long after I am gone. I take a slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor. I look around the plain walls of my sanctuary, completely unbothered by the lack of expensive modern art or gaudy chandeliers. I sit perfectly content at my small kitchen table, eating a simple, perfectly cooked meal. The modest apartment is completely quiet, but it is absolutely not lonely. It is the profound, beautiful silence of a man who fought fiercely for his respect, completely protected his empire, and unequivocally won. The screen fades to black on his peaceful smile. Sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my kitchen, I often reflect on the true nature of wealth. I spent 4 decades breaking my back in a hostile industry, fighting against systemic barriers that were explicitly designed to keep a young African-American man firmly at the bottom of the economic ladder. I accumulated millions of dollars, believing that financial power would provide an impenetrable shield for my family. I wanted to build a towering fortress that would permanently protect my son from the harsh, unforgiving indignities I was forced to endure. I completely failed to realize that shielding a person from every single struggle does not make them strong. It makes them fragile, entitled, and ultimately dangerous. Hardship is the heavy anvil upon which true character is forged. By removing the weight of consequence from Darren's shoulders, I inadvertently crushed his moral compass. I handed him the keys to a kingdom he did not build, and he used that unearned power to construct a hollow, parasitic life. The most profound lesson I learned from this devastating ordeal is that bloodline does not automatically equate to loyalty. We are strictly conditioned by society to believe that familial bonds are entirely unbreakable and inherently sacred. I allowed that dangerous assumption to blind me to the undeniable reality sitting right across my dining table. Darren and Abigail viewed my unconditional love as a highly exploitable weakness. They believed my advanced age rendered me obsolete and defenseless. True family is not determined by a shared last name or inherited genetics. Genuine family is defined entirely by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the shared commitment to uplift one another during the darkest storms. I found far more integrity in Maya, a hardworking waitress fighting for her education, than I ever found in the aristocratic social circles my son desperately worshipped. I replaced a treacherous heir with a brilliant, honorable protege who actually understands the supreme value of honest love. I also learned the absolute terrifying power of deliberate silence. When faced with blatant disrespect and profound cruelty, the natural human instinct is to scream, to aggressively defend your honor, and to demand immediate validation. Yielding to that explosive anger only hands your power directly over to your abusers. When Abigail shoved that basket of dry bread toward me, I did not waste my breath arguing with a fool. I smiled, stepped into the shadows, and systematically dismantled her entire universe. Retaliation does not require a loud theatrical performance. True uncompromising justice is achieved through cold, calculated, and decisive action. You must never allow arrogant, prejudiced individuals to dictate your emotional state or trick you into surrendering your hard-earned dignity. Stand firm in your truth, organize your resources, and let the devastating consequences of their own toxic actions serve as their ultimate punishment. You hold the pen that writes your final chapter. If you are currently suffering under the heavy weight of toxic family members who constantly diminish your worth and exploit your generosity, I urge you to stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Protect your peace, establish absolute boundaries, and never be afraid to quietly change the locks on your life. Your dignity is entirely non-negotiable. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from today and share your experiences of standing